Hi there, welcome to the first module on this course. In this module we're going to dive in there and get started writing some HTML code. And we're going to learn how to write a few different tags, and we're going to learn how to make connections between one page and another using hyperlinks. And finally we're going to look at the world's first web page and really sort of pick it apart and understand how it works. So I look forward to seeing you on the first lesson.
Before we begin to start coding, let's have a look at what's involved with the whole idea of web browsers and web pages. So just to begin with, you'll hear the terms client-side and server-side as we go through this course. So let's have a look at what those are. So here's our laptop, and that's known as the client machine. Okay, so we are client-side when we are looking, when the user is looking at their device. Here are some servers. This is a data center, quite a lot of servers going there, but a server could also be just a desktop machine that's sitting somewhere hosting a web page. So the server hosts the pages, it contains the pages that it's going to send to the client, which is the laptop. Now, all of these computers, the servers and the clients' computers as well, are all part of the internet, and the internet is the interconnected network of machines worldwide. The World Wide Web is sort of the information that sits on that. So there's a bit of a difference between the two. So when we talk about the web, we're talking about that information. So what happens when you're looking for a web page, particular web page? You type in the address of the web page, which is known as the URL, Universal Resource Locator, and it sends a request to the server. And the server then gets that data and sends it back to the client machine. So that's all there is to that. Of course, it's a bit more complicated behind the scenes, but for now, this is the principle you need to know. When we look at a web page, we can actually see it in a number of different ways. So we can see how it looks on the World Wide Web when a browser has interpreted it. So we get the full thing. We get the pictures, and we get the text, and we get all the headings and the colors and all things like that. But we can also look at a web page in its very basic form, which is the source code. That's the plain text form, and that's where we see all the formatting that makes it into that web page. I'd like to show you an example of this. Here we have the University of London web page for Goldsmiths. You'll see this coming up quite a bit when I'm demonstrating things. You can see here it has logos, it has headings, it has different sections, it has some icons, it has an image. It has lists down the side of navigation. So it's sort of the web page that we're used to when we're looking online. Now, the other way of looking at that is to see the source code of it. And we can do that if we go to View in Chrome, Developer, and View Source. We see the behind the scenes part of that web page. We see the HTML and the other aspects that tell the browser how to display it. And this is an example of that. So all of this code that you see when you look at the code of a web page, all of this builds that page that we've just looked at. On this course, we're going to take a three-part approach to web development. So we're going to show you how you display content on a web page, how you mark it up and get it onto the page. We're going to show you how to make that content look good. And we're going to show you how to make that content interactive. And that'll be throughout the course when we're dealing with client-side stuff. Just to go a little deeper into that, so imagine that this blue box here holds all of our web page, all the components necessary to display the web page. We have the HTML, and that's the page structure. We'll get onto that in much more detail next time. So the HTML is the structure of the page, and it looks a bit like this. You can see some tags here, and they're in angular brackets. You'll get very used to those in no time. And then we have what's known as CSS. And CSS is what defines the appearance of a page. So we'll see things here like the margins, the paddings, the line height, the white space, what the backgrounds are. Then we have JavaScript. This is an example of some JavaScript. And that's what adds the interactivity. That's the programming part of the web page. And without it, we just have a very static page. Now, when we're teaching this, we will teach you HTML5, which is the current version of HTML. We will also teach you CSS3, which is the current standard of CSS, and we'll be using the most up-to-date JavaScript. And as well as learning from scratch, we're also going to be using things like Bootstrap, which allow you to do this very quickly and simply once you know what's going on behind the scenes. So all of these things together display as a web page on our browser. Okay, so this is it. It's time to get started. This is where we start learning HTML. Here are some of the basics. What is HTML? HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. It's a text file that contains small markup tags, and last time you saw those, a little clip of the code where you can see the angular brackets. The markup tags tell the web browser how they should display the page. So they are a markup language that describes the content. Now, this is important to differentiate from the appearance, for example. And an HTML file always will end in .htm or more commonly .html. So when we're saving our files, we're going to save them as .html files. And an HTML file can be created just using a simple text editor, and we'll have some suggestions for you in a moment. So when we create our HTML files, we'll be creating them in a text editor. We'll be saving them as type plain text. We don't want any formatting at all. And we'll be saving them with the extension .html. The purpose of HTML is for markup. It's not for programming. And the reason for that is that it can structure and describe content really, really well, but it's limited in how interactive it is. It lacks logic, and that's what the programming language brings. Unless you add interactivity, an HTML page is going to look the same every time you view it. So later on when we do JavaScript, you'll be learning a bit more about making those HTML pages more responsive. So here we can see this is an example of the first ever web page that was created 26 years ago by Tim Berners-Lee, who basically invented the World Wide Web. And there's a copy of it online that you can have a look at. It's a very, very simple page, but it was groundbreaking because that has led to the web as we know it today. So you can see it just has a little header at the top and some text and these blue links, and they're the hyperlinks. And that is the default for links when you make a web page. They will always be, they will come up as blue. Of course, we're going to change that by using CSS. So there you go, very, very simple. And think of how far we've come in 25 years. Let's talk a little bit about the development environment. For this, you're going to be creating text files, as we said, using some kind of plain text editor. The ones we suggest you use, I'm going to be using Text Wrangler, which is a text editor for the Mac. And the other one, if you're using a Windows machine, we suggest Notepad++. Not Notepad, that's not going to be enough. Notepad++ allows you to edit code. There's also Sublime Text, which is becoming increasingly popular. It's a very nice environment to develop in, and it's available for Macs, for Windows, for Linux machines. So take your pick. Marco, I think, is using Sublime Text further on in the course, and I'll stick with Text Wrangler now. So you'll get a bit of a flavour for what each one does. But go and have a look. I have here on the slide the different web addresses for those. So do have a look and see which ones you prefer. Play around with them and see what you think. The really important thing is don't use word processing software. It's a very bad idea. It leads to lots of unnecessary things being put into your code, and it is a pain to get rid of. So please don't do that. Don't try and use Word or anything like that. Make sure it is a text editor that works with plain text files. Now let's talk a little bit about the browser. So the browser is our way of accessing the web, and you would need to be able to use a browser for that, but there are so many different ones out there. So how do you decide which browser is best? Well, currently we can look at browser stats from all over the world, and currently Google Chrome is the leading browser by a long way. So I'm going to stick to Google Chrome for this. It's also got some very good development tools as well that we'll be making use of. There's no such thing as uniformity across browsers. Web pages may be developed that you hope will look the same across browsers, but there are so many quirks to each one that it's very hard to tell. So don't think that just because you make your web page work on Google Chrome that it's going to transfer seamlessly to other browsers. You're always going to need to check that because it just will not necessarily be uniform. As well as displaying web pages, browsers often have development tools built in, and I'd like to show you some of these now. Back to our web page. And let's look at the developer. So if we go to View, Developer, Developer Tools, we see a little console at the side with lots of different things going on. So here, for example, we have all of the source code. It goes in and out. You can open and close sections of it. And when we put our cursor over different parts of these, we see different things. So for example, here, I have got the cursor over header, and you can see on the left hand side that the header is highlighted in blue. So we're able to tell what we're working with when we put our cursor over that. And down here you see lots of other different bits. This is something we'll look at later, this box, when we come to CSS. It's a really important part of that, but you can ignore it for now. So just so you know, you've got lots of different things that you can look at, lots of sources of links that are in that file, so many things that tools that you've got at hand. We're going to keep it really simple for the beginning. So that's it for the background of HTML, and in the next bit we're going to actually build our web page and do the first tags.
Right, it's time to start editing some code. And the first thing we're going to do is fire up our text editor. And once we've got the text editor running, we can start writing HTML. So let's go in there now. So I've started my Sublime text editor in this case. And remember, you can use other ones such as Notepad++ or Text Wrangler. And so I'll go into the File menu and create a new file. And let's have a quick look at what's on the screen here. So we've got this number 1 here. That's telling me which line of the file I'm on. So you see if I add extra lines in the file, it increases. So that's not really part of the document, that's just part of the interface telling me about what I'm editing. And then I've got this thing here which is a tab, so I can have lots of files open at the same time. The same way you can have with a web browser, you can have lots of tabs with different files open at the same time. So let's write our first HTML tag. I'm going to start with the H1 tag. So I've got an open angle bracket there, and then I type H1, and then I close it. So that's the open. So that starts an HTML tag, and then you put the name of the tag, and then you finish it like that. And then we put the contents of the tag. And so I'm going to set this to "This is my first web page," and then once you've finished writing what's going in the tag, you can then end the tag. End. So we have the angle bracket again, then this / which means end of H1. So we can interpret this as starts H1, contents of H1, end H1. And let's save that. So I do File and Save. And I've got a folder ready here, and I'm going to call it index.html. So remember that Kate was saying that HTML files normally end with an HTML extension or a .htm extension, and you'll need to make sure that you've configured your operating system to show you your file extensions. So for example, in Windows you'll have to edit your settings in your Explorer. I think in Linux it probably shows them by default, and also on a Mac. So we're saving it as index.html, which means it's the first page in the website. Okay, so I save that. And then I go into my file browser, which is here, and I browse to where that file is saved. And I right click on the file, and now I get to choose how I open it. So I've already got it open in Sublime Text, so I'm not going to edit it there. I actually want to view it in my web browser. So here it is. Here's my web browser, Google Chrome. So that's opened it, and that's my first web page, and you can see that the font it's used is quite large and bold. I mean, I can zoom in just to make it really clear. So that's large and bold, and if I just put some text in here without any HTML, this is outside of a tag, okay, and save that. So file, save, or once you get into editing this stuff, you're going to have to learn the keyboard shortcuts. So in this case, I do Control and S to save it, and then I go back over to my web browser, and if I want to see what the new file looks like, I have to hit this little reload button here, and you see again there's a keyboard shortcut for reloading, which is Control and R. So what you'll end up doing is doing your edits in your file, doing Control S, then popping over to the web browser, then doing Control R to reload the page. Right, so let's look in this web browser. So we've got this big large font here, and then we've got this kind of much smaller text here. And so what's happened is the web browser has seen this H1 tag, and instead of just displaying an H1 tag, it's actually decided, oh right, I'm going to now display this text with a special formatting, because H1 actually means main heading. So the web browser knows, a main heading needs to be big and large and bold. So it's choosing to add that formatting to that display. And that's one of the sort of things to know about HTML, is that we just say what the different parts of the document mean. So we're saying this bit of the document is the heading, and we can define another bit of the document as being content or whatever. And the browser then interprets that structure that we give it, and it chooses how to format it. When we get into the next module and we look at CSS, we'll find out how we can actually tell the browser, don't use this formatting, use a different formatting, so we can control the way it displays the page. But for now, we're just letting the browser make decisions for us about how it should display an H1 or how it should display the other tags. So let's add some more tags and see what they do. That's our H1 tag, and we can normally you'd put your paragraphs of text in a P tag, and you can see what I'm doing is I'm kind of creating a structure here. So I actually I indent that slightly so it's easier to read. So that the first paragraph, the second paragraph, and while we're at it, we'll do one more type of heading tag, which is called H2. This is the second heading, or we could call it the subtitle, right? So Control S, back over to the web browser, Control R, and right. So let's just have a quick look at that. So we created an H1 tag for the main heading. That's the largest text we can see there, and then we created an H2 tag for the subheading, and that's slightly smaller but still bold. And then we put 2 paragraphs in, and that's it. So we've created our first example of a very simple web page. And so as we go through this module, we're going to find out about more types of tags that we can use. In the previous lesson, you found out how you can mark up different bits of a document to say what they are for. For example, you are marking up the main title of the document with an H1 tag, and then you marked up the second subtitle of the document with an H2 tag, and then you created some paragraphs with P tags. And that's called marking up, and that is what ML stands for in HTML, markup language, because HTML is a language for marking up text. But what about the HT? What does that stand for? Well, when HTML came out, the really exciting thing about it was that it wasn't just one document or even a set of documents, but it was a document that could link to other documents. So it was that connection that you could make between one document and another. So you could make a website with lots of pages that are all connected together. Somebody else could make a web page with lots of documents connected together. And then you could link your pages together. And that was very exciting at the time. And that is what the HT stands for, hypertext. Hypertext is this idea that one bit of text or one document can link to another one. So how do we turn our page into a sort of linked up hypertext document? Let's go and add some more code. So the basic tag that we need, yes, it's just another tag, is the A tag. Okay, and so let's just try it out. And I'm going to create a link to a document called About Me. So I'll put in the text, go to the About Me page. Right, so save that and reload. And nothing's happened yet, it's just another paragraph. But the problem with a hyperlink is you need to tell the web browser where that hyperlink goes to. So it's like it's a signpost, if you like. So well, if the user clicks on this link, I want you to go somewhere else. So it's kind of more of an active thing than just tagging up a bit of text. What we have to do is add something called an attribute. So that's the attribute there. So you can see it's inside the brackets there. And the attribute is called the href, or hypertext reference attribute. And essentially we're going to say, I want you to go to this page when they click on the link. Okay, well, I haven't created that page yet, so let's just do another new page, file, new file, and all about me. So I save this one as about me.html. So you've probably seen, the classic thing that web pages will have a page called Contact Us or About Us or something like that. So this is my About Me page, and so I've saved that, and then I've got my document, my A tag in my index file, which links to the About Me file. So let's reload again. And what do you notice about that? Well, I'm zooming in a bit there. You can see that the link has now been underlined and it's gone blue. So again, this is an example of the web browser looking at our hypertext markup and just saying, oh, okay, that's a link, so I'm going to apply some formatting to make it really clear to the user that that's a link going somewhere, that it's going to do something. And there's another little thing the browser does for us as well. Let's look in detail what happens here. So here's my pointer. If the pointer goes over the top of the link, you can see it turns into this kind of gloved hand, which implies that I can do something. I can click on it. And if I just mouse over the other text, you can see it turns into this kind of caret mark, which allows me to select. Right, so zoom back out again. And if I click on that link, let's see if it works. Okay, didn't seem to work. Well, the reason is that I've actually called my page About Me, not About. Okay, so I just update that link to say About Me instead of About. And I go back and reload the page again, click on the link. It works now. I'm going to zoom that one into the same level so that they look equivalent. Okay, so I've just made a hyperlink. I've linked from the index page through to the About Me page, and that's great. But how do I get back to the index page again? Well, you can probably guess. I just have to put a link going back the other way, right? So let's go into the About Me page and create a link going back to index. Go back, save. So that's my About Me page, now has a link back to index. So if I click on it, you can see it's now got a go back button. I can press that. So now I can just jump between the two pages, and I can jump from the index page to the About Me page and back again, and essentially I've kind of created a little loop between those two pages. Now the problem is that as your website becomes more elaborate, you have more than two pages. So what we use is something called a nav bar, which is kind of short for navigation bar. So which you can imagine it's a bar, which might be horizontal or it might be vertical. And on that bar we have the ability to navigate. So what we have is a set of links that might cover all the different pages on our site. So I'm going to create one more page for my site, and then I'm going to create a nav bar which connects them all together. So I'm going to create a Contact Me page. Okay, so that's just the title, and I'll save that one and I'll call it contact.html. So now I've got a 3-page site, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a navigation bar here. So I'm going to go to the home page. Actually, let's shorten it a bit because it's a navigation bar. Home page. So the first link is going to go to the home page, which is going to be called index.html, which we've already created. The second link is About Me. Let's shorten it even more. The third link is going to be the contact page. Okay, so let's look at that in its totality. So we've got 1, 2, 3 links there. So let's save that one. So this is the index page I'm editing, so I reload that. Okay, so this I've got these kind of this all underlined at the bottom there. But the problem is it looks like all those links are being kind of squashed together. But if I look at my code, actually I've got loads of sort of spaces between the links, which is a bit of a problem. Why is it ignoring all that space? Well, that's a deliberate feature of HTML. It's called white space, and it's the idea that if there's kind of empty text between the tags, it just gets ignored. So it means that you can lay out your document in a really readable way, but when it gets rendered in the web browser, actually it just kind of removes all that unnecessary sort of noise. So if we do want to have a gap between those links, then we have to actually use another HTML feature called an entity, and I'll just show you how to do that. So we start like this, and non-breaking. So it stands for non-breaking space. Okay, so a non-breaking space essentially just means a space. So you force it to put a space there. And so in between each A tag, I've put one of these special entities, and hopefully that should space out my navigation bar. Okay, so I've reloaded, and you can see now I've got nice spaces after each item in the nav bar. And I'm going to add one more thing just to make it really clear that, and I mean actually I'm going to put this at the top of the page because it's kind of easier to find if it's at the top of the page. So save that, reload over there. So I've just copied and pasted it up to the top of the page, and then I'm just going to put a sort of a line underneath it. Okay, let's just do that, and then reload. Okay, so now I've got a kind of neat looking nav bar with 3 links and a line underneath. So the only thing I need to do now is to add that nav bar to my other 2 pages. So again, it's just a copy and paste job. So I just grab the code, copy that, jump over to the About Me page, put it at the top of that, and jump over to the contact page and put it there, and make sure they're all saved. So then, should be able to jump between the page. Sorry, they're coming smaller because I'm zoomed in. Let me just zoom in there. Right, there we go. So now I can jump between the pages, and you know the nav bar is always there. So it's this idea that the user has a kind of consistent way of moving through the different pages. And that's it. We've created a nav bar using hypertext links in our HTML document. So we've created our first hypertext website with connections between 3 different pages, and you've seen how you can create a basic nav bar. But what we're going to do now is learn about a few more useful HTML tags that you're going to see on every single page, more or less. So the first one we're going to find out about is the img tag, which allows us to embed images in our site. So let's go into the code. So what I'd like to do is on my About Me page, I would like to have some sort of image to maybe show a picture of what I look like. So let's see if I can find that. So I'm editing aboutme.html, and in my folder here I've actually got a file called myk.png where I look a bit strange, but that's okay. It's the internet, and I'm going to just look at that. So that's myk.png. Okay, so PNG is the file extension. That means it's an image file, unlike the HTML files. And so normally, if you're working in a word processor, you just get that image file and drop it in, right? You drag and drop it, but we can't do that in HTML. What we have to do is make our pages out of lots of different pieces. So yeah, we have the HTML file, and if we want to have an image file in that page, we actually have to use a tag and pull the image in with a tag. And as I said earlier, it's the img tag. So let's do that. img. Okay, and normally an image tag, it doesn't actually have any text inside it. You don't put any text inside an image tag. So we can use a shorthand. We don't have to have this close tag here. We can just put that in like that at the end of the tag, and that sort of opens and closes it in one go. And you notice I've put an src attribute in here, and this is how I tell the browser where to load the image from. So it's called myk.png. And a top tip here is that don't put spaces in your file names. So if you really want to put several words in a file name, put underscores in. So let's say it was called myk picture. You wouldn't do it like that. You'd always put underscores in instead. But that's okay. I don't need that for now. I'm just going to call it myk. And let's save that and go back to the browser and go to the About Me page. And you can see that now, oh dear, I've got a sort of giant image, which isn't really what I was after. So what I can do is I can put another attribute in to set the size of the image. So let's say we want a width of, say, 50%, like that. You can see now the browser has cleverly set the width of the image to precisely sort of 50% or half of the width of the whole page. And so as I kind of make the page wider, you can see that it's actually automatically changing the size of the image to reflect that 50%. Okay, so I've embedded an image, great, and it's automatically resizing it for me, which is what you might call responsive. So that's our very first step into responsive web design, the idea that depending on the size of the image, the page that you're looking at, depending on the size of the window, it can the page adapts to that size. We could also hard code it. We could say, no, I want it to be 150 pixels, and that's it. And then you'll see, it stays the same size, regardless of how wide the window is. But I quite like the responsive feel of it, so I'm going to stick it to 50%. Okay, and then maybe below the image, I'd put some sort of caption as a sort of third level heading. This is me looking the other way, right? So we just put a little caption under there. You can see underneath there's a little caption. Well, we can actually do something clever here. We can actually turn an image into a link. So what I could do is put an A tag around the image. So if I just format it out nicely so that it's really obvious what's going on. Okay, so there's my image tag, and then I do end of A there. I've now turned the image into a link. Of course, I need to tell it where to go. Well, maybe it could just go straight to the image file itself. So now that link's just going to go straight to myk.png. So let's see what that does. Okay, and zooming in again, let's just check that mouse pointer. So that's the normal mouse pointer. When I go over here, you can see it turns into a sort of clickable thing, mouse pointer. And you'll see at the bottom of that browser window as well that it's actually popping up some information about where that link is going to go. So let's click on it. And you can see now it's just showing the image file. It's not showing the HTML anymore. So I can use my browser back button to get back out. Okay. So I've used the img tag. Now another tag I wanted to show you about is the tags that we can use for listing. So quite often on web pages we want to create lists of things. So I don't know if it's the most popular type of web page on the net, but you certainly will have come across the best 5 Coursera web programming MOOCs, for example, or maybe the best 5 pictures of funny animals, or whatever it is that people look at on the internet. So how do we create these kind of lists of things? Well, I'm going to go to the contact page, and I'm going to use, that seems like a sensible place where we might have a list of things. And so there's different ways of creating lists. You've got ordered list, OL, so let's see how that looks. And again, we use that concept of one tag being inside another tag. Okay, so we can do that. And my 133 my street. Here is my address. Save that, and then we go over to the contact page. So you can see it's put a 1, and if I put another thing there, my town and I can add another one. My nation. So you can see that there we've created sort of a list, and the browser again has automatically done some stuff for me. So it's obviously automatically selected the font, but it's also indented this list slightly. So it's pushed it to the in a bit, and it's automatically created a 1, 2, 3. Another type of list is the unformatted list, and let's just see how that looks. And so it's an unordered list, and UL gives you bullet points, as you can see there. Instead of having numbers, I've now got bullet points, and you can see that the browser again has indented it, and it's created this special circular icon to indicate a bullet point. And I didn't have to do any of that. That's all the browser interpreting it for me. There's one more called the description list, which you can go and look at yourself and find out about. In fact, we're going to see it in a later lesson. So that's it. So we've just seen how to use some other types of tags. We've used the image tag, and we've used 2 types of list tags. And you've seen that we can put one tag inside another tag. Now we're going to learn a couple more HTML tags, which are really useful if you want to make a sort of properly structured document. And you'll see why that's important as we work through. So let's go back to one of our pages and start editing the code. I'm going to start with the index page. Now, the proper structure for an HTML document is actually not just to start putting your content tags in straight away. What we normally start with is the top level tag. So remember, we've seen that you can put one tag inside another tag. Well, that's exactly what you're meant to do. So all of the tags in a document are supposed to appear inside an HTML thing, and then we have inside that we have a body tag. So we'd normally tab that one out, and I'm going to select all the rest of the content like that, and then tab that out twice. Okay, so what have I done there? Well, I've created an HTML tag, and inside that I've created a body tag, and then I've put all the rest of that content inside that. And so because we have to start and end tags, so I now end the body tag and then end the HTML tag. Right. Now, every body needs a head, so we're going to actually add one of those as well. Okay. So that's at the same level as the body tag. So we start with HTML wraps the whole thing. Then we have a head at the top, and then we have a body below it. And all of our content goes into the body, unlike people. But in the head, what we do is we put special extra information about the document, which we might refer to as metadata. So metadata is data about data, which might sound a bit strange, but think of it like this. Imagine you're listening to some music on your music playing device, and it pops up on the screen the title of the track, and it pops up the name of the person who maybe recorded that track. But that doesn't actually tell you what the track sounds like. It's not the real sound that you're listening to. It's just some sort of information about the track, and that's metadata. So the title and the composer of the track, that's metadata. And in the same way, with an HTML document, we have the body, which contains the actual information, the proper information. Like the heading and the paragraphs and the lists and all that stuff. And then we have a head, which contains the metadata, which tells you information about this HTML page. For example, we might define which language it is in, and we might define other sort of information about the document. So we can actually set a title. That's the sort of simplest thing. And normally you'd set the title to probably the same as whatever you put in your H1 tag there. So let's do that. And if I then reload that in the browser, you'll see that if I could actually spell the word title, you'd see that the title appears up there. So this is my first web page is now there. So anything And if you like, you can see that's not the main content. The main content is here. But then that's just appearing on the tab in Chrome there, just showing us that's the title. So I can put whatever I like in there. You can also add a description into that head region, just describing what the page is about. And this information helps for search engines. So if the search engine is trying to index your site and you've got a nice kind of title and description, it makes for a better indexing and so on. So that's kind of the basics of how to structure your documents properly. So I'm going to sort of apply that structuring back across to the other 2 pages on our website. So we just go up to the top of the document, drop that in there. I'll set the title up later. We just put a placeholder in, and then over there. And remember, just so that it makes the document readable, we tab that out twice. So that shows you that tag is sort of a higher level in the tree, if you like, than that one. And we'll do the same over here. Right, so that's now dropped that out. And then we need to add the closing tags, end of body, end of HTML, and drag that one back in. So, and I'll drag that back over there. Okay. Now, you'll notice that before we added all that stuff, the web browser was still able to display our pages just fine. And the thing is, web browsers are actually very robust. They're very good at dealing with badly written HTML. I just wanted to show you one more example of sort of badly written HTML before the end of the lesson. So let's go to that list and imagine that we did something like this. Okay, so what I've done is I've started a list element inside the UL, which is what I should be doing. So remember that the unordered list sort of wraps all of the elements, but then the unordered list ends, and then my list element ends. So if you like, the list element is overlapping the tag that it's inside of. And see, again, the web browser doesn't crash or anything, but it's not the correct way to write HTML. You shouldn't have tags that can overlap other tags. Tags are either inside another tag or they're outside another tag. They can't kind of overlap it like this. So we should never sort of end up with a structure like that. So the correct structure is, of course, to put it back in there. Okay. Right, so we've learned how to kind of wrap our HTML documents up with an HTML tag and head and body. And we've also learned how we can sort of avoid overlapping tags in HTML, which can cause a lot of confusion in the rendering of the document later on. So now it's time to apply some of this knowledge we've gained about HTML and tags and use it to analyze the world's first web page. Because now we're not just consumers of web pages, we can actually look at the code that underlies them and understand it. So let's go and look at that page now. So in my text editor here, I've actually got the address of the world's first web page. So I'm going to copy that and open a new window and paste it in there. And you can see here, there's the page. But as I said, we're not just viewing the page, we're going to dig in and look at the code. So I go View menu, Developer, and View Source. And that shows me the HTML code that actually makes up the page. And now you should be able to read this a bit and see what it means. So what do you notice? Well, the first thing is there's no HTML tag. Okay, so maybe there's something wrong with this document. And then there's a header tag. We've never heard of that. What's a header tag? Well, so what's going on here? Why is it so different? This is an earlier version of HTML. So remember Kate mentioned that we're actually learning HTML5, which was the current version. And so HTML is a sort of living language. People are constantly debating in the W3C, who kind of control the standards. They're debating what should be in there and what should change and whether this thing doesn't quite work or maybe they need to add this. So for example, in the latest version of HTML, it made it really easy to embed videos and to embed audio, which you'd not been able to do before without using external kind of plugins. So that's an example of something they added in HTML5. So what we're looking at in the first web page is probably pre-HTML1. So it's really a really early version. So some of the tags have been changed since then. So I reckon that the header tag has probably changed into the head tag. But we've got the title tag. Okay, we still use that. And then now I'm noticing something else about it, which is that all the tags have capital letters. And again, we don't do that anymore. We tend to use lowercase for our tags. Now something looking a bit more familiar now. So we've got a body tag there. And World Wide Web, so that's an H1 tag. Okay, we still have that. And then we've got a link. A name is not href. So we've got a hyperlink there. What else have we got? More links. More links there. An A tag. And then we've got this other type of list that I mentioned earlier, which is the sort of the description list. And so you've got a DL, and inside that you get a DT and a DD. And you can see, if we just look at how that looks, you can see it's slightly different from our normal lists in that you get your one part of the list is displayed there, then you kind of get a description. And this type of list is a sort of slightly more complicated than the UL and OL, but it allows you to get this slightly more sophisticated layout where you kind of have it's a bit like a dictionary where you have a term and then you have a definition. Moving on, so nothing else too exciting in there. So the body ends, and that's more or less it. And you can see there's a bunch of links to HTML files and so on. So it's really quite a simple page. Yeah, so that was it. So we looked at the world's first HTML page and we pulled it apart and were able to really understand, just from using the information we'd gained this module, what's going on in that page. What does responsive actually mean? So let's look at a web page which is responsive and see how it behaves. So I'm going to look at the University of London Goldsmiths web page and just sort of mess around with it, and I'll show you how it sort of changes as I'm doing that. So here we have the web page, and I've got my web browser window for the full width of my screen. And if I change the width of the browser window by just simply sort of resizing it like this, you can see that the page is looking pretty much the same, but at there's a tipping point when suddenly the web page seems to change. So something's happening there. The web page is changing in response to me changing the width of the browser window. Let's carry on with that and see if anything else happens. So I'm narrowing it still. Right, so that is a responsive web page. And so what it's all about is the idea that people might be accessing your web page using different devices. For example, if I'm accessing it with my mobile phone, then I might have a quite narrow screen, narrow and tall. If I'm accessing it with my tablet device, then I have a different size screen again, a different ratio on the screen. And if I'm accessing it with my laptop, then again I've got a wide and sort of short screen, if you like. And the idea of responsive web design is to make your web page so that it can deal with those different devices and display the information on the web page in the most sort of usable way for each of those types of devices. So as it went through those 3 stages of change, you can see that it was kind of removing bits of navigation or shrinking icons. So when we're looking at it on a phone, which is the narrowest display, it's got a really minimal design. So let's just look at that again. So you can see we haven't got a navigation bar, but if we click on these lines here, then a navigation bar appears. And the search button is just a simple icon which we can click on and a search box appears. And then when we step up to the next level, the search icon is larger and the navigation bar is more sort of clearly labelled. And when we go up to the maximum size, you can see the full navigation bar has popped up there across the top. Okay, and in the next module, we're going to look at how we can implement responsive designs using CSS. And it's easier than you might think. Congratulations! You finished the first module in the course. Now you know how to use the HTML language. But there's plenty more to learn, so please go ahead and take the second module where we're going to learn the CSS language. Welcome to Module 2. Now we're ready to learn another language, CSS. This is going to allow us to take control over how the web browser displays our pages using fonts, colours and layout. And we're even going to dive in and look at the Bootstrap library. So I look forward to seeing you on the first lesson. Hi there, welcome to the first lesson in this new module. And what we're going to be looking at is the Cascading Style Sheet language, otherwise known as CSS. And this is the sort of companion language to HTML, which allows you to instruct the browser as to exactly how it can display your HTML page. So you'll remember when we looked at our page before that the browser was actually selecting fonts and sizes of text and doing a bit of layout for us. And we were sort of given limited control about how exactly everything looked. And that's because the idea of an HTML document is that it specifies the content of the page, and the CSS document aims to specify the way that the content is displayed. And so this separation means that it's very clear what should go where. So what we're going to do now is see what goes into a CSS file. So let's dive into the code and start writing some CSS. Okay, so I've just created a new file in my text editor. And I'm going to just write some basic CSS. So CSS sort of consists of what you might call a set of instructions where you modify how some part of the document is going to be displayed. So in this case, you can imagine this instruction applies to the body tag. So it says body there. And what I can then do is in these brackets, which are the curly brackets, I can start telling it how to modify the text or display inside the body tag. So let's try something out. Okay, so that says background : green. So maybe you can guess what background green is going to do. Let's try it out. So I'll save that, and first of all I'm going to call it styles.css. So the file name is styles.css, so the file extension is CSS. And I go back to my web page and reload. Well, oh, nothing's happened yet. Well, you actually have to tell the browser to use the styles CSS file before it can apply those styles to your file. It can't just magically find it, unfortunately. So we have to write another tag in our HTML which connects our HTML document to that CSS file. So back into index.html, I'm editing that here, and you can see I'm in the top part of the document where inside the head, because this connecting a document to a style sheet is not the actual content of the document, it's metadata, it's information about the document. And what I have to write is something like this. Okay, link, and first of all I'm making a link between a sort of semantic or meaningful link between this document and another document. It's not like a hyperlink, but it's kind of similar. And this link is actually saying, okay, here's where you can find some styles which work with this document. So that's what that relationship thing means. And then I have to say what kind of document it is. So I say type equals text/CSS. And finally I have to tell it where the document is. And so that's the file name that I just specified. So if we save this, and then go back to the browser and reload, I think you can see that my page has gone green. Right, so that's great. But what happens if I go to another page? Oh, well, it's gone white again. So the index page has gone green, but the about me page has stayed with a white background. I wonder if you can think about why that is. So how might I fix it? Well, I'll then have to get this link and put that into all of my documents. So I'll open up About Me, save that, and then open the final document, which is Contact, and I'm going to put the link in the top of that one as well. Okay, great. So now hopefully they should all be green. Right. Okay, so I've got 3 green documents, but maybe green isn't the best background colour. So I'm going to actually specify the background colour as black. Let's see if we can do white text on a black background. So there we go. And again, it's not really ideal because it's a bit difficult to see those links. But still, what you might notice is as I'm clicking through those 3 different pages, they all take on that updated style, because all 3 of those pages are all looking at the same style sheet. And that's kind of one of the key points about CSS, is that you write all the styles in one place and point all of your documents at it, so that any changes you make to the styles immediately apply to all of the documents. So rather than having to change the style in every document every time you make an edit. So that's a really handy feature. So let's see if we can change the text style. And I want it to be white. Okay. So let's go to the home page. And so the instruction to change the text is actually to specify colour there. So colour says, right, set the colour of the text to white, but you can see that the A tags are still blue. So maybe we can fix that as well. So we just say, okay, I'm specifying a style for the A tag as well, and I want those to be, maybe I'm going to make them grey with the American US spelling. Okay, so you can see now I've got grey links on all of my pages. Okay, so now I've kind of used colour to sort of differentiate between the main text of the document, which is that white text, and the links, which have now gone grey. And so you see I'm gradually gaining control over the sort of formatting of my web page. And so what have we done? So we've learned how to include an external CSS file on our pages, and we've seen how we can do some basic changes to the way that the page is displayed. And in the following lessons, we're going to see more about how we can really gain control over how that page looks. Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to find out how we can use CSS to control the fonts that our website uses to display text. And so essentially fonts come in 3 varieties that we can use meaningfully on websites. So remember that fonts, there's many thousands of fonts in the world, but not your web browser might not necessarily have access to all of them. So we tend to think of them as appearing in 3 groups. So we could call those sans serif, serif, and monospaced. So what's the difference between those? Well, let's write some code and see how they look when we use those different font types. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by redefining the fonts on the heading tag. So I write H1 there, and I'm going to put in font family, and I can set it really basically to something like that. So let's just dig into the browser, see how that looks. Okay. And you see when I reloaded that, it really didn't make any difference to those fonts. So let's try this. Okay, so you probably saw it change when I reloaded that time. So we're looking at this text here. Let me just flick it back to serif again. Okay. So what does that mean, serif? Okay, well if we zoom right in fact, we don't need to zoom right in anymore. We can just say use the font size CSS and set it to some great big font size like that. Okay, perfect. So I've set the font size to 100 point just so we can really see what serif means essentially. Now, if we look at, say, have a look at that S there, you can see it's not just a sort of nice smooth line. It's actually got some extra bits on it there. So if you look at the end of the S there, it kind of widens out into a little piece. And if we take that, if we turn that back to sans serif again, you see that the S kind of ends, it just kind of goes to a straight line at the end there instead of having that wiggly bit on the end. Okay, so that is the basic difference between sans and sans serif and serif. Essentially, sans, in the French, means without, and a serif is basically the little wiggly bit on the end of the letter. So you can imagine that sans serif means without the wiggly bit, and serif means with the wiggly bit. So if you look at that font now, you'll see, yeah, that's obviously sans serif because it doesn't have any fancy additions to the font. Okay, and so back to serif, you can see the T kind of has the special bits on the end, and so it's a sort of more elaborate font. And typically your serif fonts are what you would see in a book, and probably the most well-known one is Times New Roman. And so when we're specifying our fonts, we can actually specify particular serif fonts. So there's not just one serif font. If you just write serif, then the operating system and the browser will sort of select just a simple serif font. But you can actually specify exactly the name of the font. And certain fonts are sort of guaranteed to be there pretty much. So Times New Roman is normally available. And so that's a way of saying, well, my favourite choice is Times New Roman, which we have to put in quotes because it has spaces in the name. But, you know, if you can't find it, then just use whatever serif font you've got available. So that's a way of sort of giving the browser some options. And we might sort of refer to that as being graceful degradation, which is a kind of web programming concept where you think, well, not every web browser is the same. Maybe someone's logged in on a Windows computer from 1997 suddenly to my web page, and they don't have all the fonts or facilities that I have now. This is quite rare these days, but so with graceful degradation, you kind of make a few possibilities, and this is an example of that. We're basically saying, well, try this font, which is my favourite, otherwise just go for this one. Okay, so I did actually say there were 3 types of fonts. The final one is the monospace font, and monospace. Okay, so let's have a look at that one. So what's special about monospace is that every letter actually has the same width. So it means that it lays out sort of perfectly in a perfectly regular grid, regardless of which letter it is. Whereas so let's have a quick look at the web browser there. You can see that if we think of this being columns, so you've got the T, then you've got the I below it, and and so on. It fits in perfect columns. But let's just go back to one of those other fonts again and see what happens. Oh, okay, all the columns have gone all over the place. Because in the design of the serif font, actually different letters have different widths. And that's sort of considered to be easier to read because the serif kind of leads the I onto the next letter. But it does mean it's not possible to make it monospaced, so it doesn't lay out in a perfect grid. And normally when you're working on code, actually the editor that you use will be using a monospaced font. So that's where it's most commonly used. So let's say you were making a web page that was talking about code and you wanted to show some code examples, you would use a monospaced font there. Then typically, something like a sans serif font is considered a more modern kind of font. So you might use it to sort of have a nice modern title on your page. And some people like just having the main body text with a sans serif font as well. Okay, so we've sort of had a bit of an exploration of different font types and how you can control the fonts that are used for different parts of your document. And we've seen that there are 3 types and considered a little bit where you might use those different types of fonts. So in the next lesson, we're going to dig a bit deeper into how we can really control the layout a bit more. Right, so we've gained control over the fonts that are being used by the web browser to display the different elements of our site. But now we might want to sort of gain a little bit more control about how it displays those links. Now remember that links are really important in a web page because those are the things that users use to jump around and navigate our page. So we might want to sort of make them a bit more obvious and a bit more fun to use. And so the browser sort of attempts to already highlight how that there's a link there by underlining it and making it blue, and also changing the cursor when someone goes over the top of it to show them that they can do something. But we can exaggerate that a little bit more. So I'm going to show you a couple of CSS tricks to do that. So first of all, I can say a hover. So this this is what we would call a selector, okay? And we've seen some selectors before. So we've seen the body selector, which says everything that matches, that's inside the body. Then the A selector, and then the A hover selector actually says hover is when the user is holding the mouse over the top of the A. So anything that's in the A. So what we can do is we can change the style when they move the mouse over. So let's see what it does. So let's say I change the color to black. So you can see actually now those links disappear. But maybe that's not ideal because I can't see where the link's going once I've moused over it. So let's give it a white background so we've got correct contrast. Okay. And finally, I don't really like that underlining, to be honest. Text decoration, none. So that's removed it. If I want to remove it for all A tags, I go back up to the master definition for the A and reload. Okay, so I prefer that now, and it's really obvious that something's going to happen when you click on that, because it now displays a nice block of color around your link. So we've played around a little bit with how the browser displays A tags to really emphasize to the user that something's going to happen, something exciting is going to happen, to encourage them to click on that link by basically setting the background color to something with a high contrast to the rest of the page, and by making the color of the font change as well. So again, that applies back to all of those pages. So now if I jump to the other page, you can see that nice link activity has applied to all of those pages. So you're doing really well with the CSS here. We can now control fonts and colors, and we can customize our links, and we're really gaining control over how our page looks in the web browser. What we're going to do now is just take a step back and consider how we can actually change the layout of the document a little bit by using margins and borders and so on. Because often, you might want to add some more elaborate design elements to your page, and so this is how we're going to do it. And we're going to actually introduce a new type of construct in CSS called a class. So let's just see how that works. So instead of writing the name of a tag here, what we can do is we can write anything we like. And I'm going to call this one indent. Okay? And so you notice I've got a full stop and then the name. So we can basically put anything here. But as I said, I'm going to put indent here, but as long as it hasn't got spaces in. And my indent is going to say margin left 10 pixels. Okay? So you might be guessing already what that's going to do. Margin left 10 pixels, right? So it's probably going to have a margin on the left which is 10 pixels in size, right? So let's see how we can use it. Well, I'm going to go down into this index file here, which we're looking at on the left, and actually see if I can create some paragraphs with an indent. This is how I do it. So if I've specified a class, I just need to do this. Okay, so I just, inside my p tag, I've added a bit of code to tell it which class I'm going to use. And you can see when I reloaded the page that actually now I have an indent on that paragraph. And let's just say we had some more text in there. Right, whoops. And we reload. You can see that the whole of that paragraph is now indented. Which might be a slightly unusual way to do it. Normally you'd maybe indent the first line and then after that stop indenting. Well, we can do that too. So we can actually just specify that maybe the indent is only on here. So span class equals indent and span. Okay, and let's see what that does. So now I've just sort of wrapped up the word the in a special indent. Okay, so did you see that? So now only the first word is indented, but then the indent affects the rest of the line, but then not the rest of the paragraph, which is quite a neat trick. So that's kind of more how you would do typesetting in a book or something like that. You might have an indentation. It's a nice way of doing typesetting, standard way. So that's using classes, and I could actually do all kinds of things. So you can imagine there's all kinds of margins you can specify. So I'm going to make a class called gap below, okay, and that's going to have margin bottom 25 pixels, okay. And so if I set my paragraph as being gap below, and I'll make sure I've saved both my files. Did you see that the second paragraph jumped down? So gap below is this new class that has a margin at the bottom. So the margin is a really good way of kind of shoving things around, and it can be really powerful. I mean, it's actually as we'll see when we look at the Bootstrap library in a later lesson, actually margins are really the way to control exactly where everything is on the page. Okay, so let's just see if we can mess around with navigation. So we can actually specify different classes of link, of course, as well. So you might want to, you don't just have to have one link type, you could actually have another link type. So we could call it green link, okay? So when they hover over a green link, won't do it that color, we'll do something else. So color is going to be green. Okay, so it's just to show you that you can have different types of link, and on these selectors you can specify the hover thing as well. So let's say in my nav bar, class equals green link. Okay, save that. Oh, no underscore, green link, like that. Reload. So I've now got different types of links. So you might want to, you can use that maybe to differentiate the different areas of the site. So you can set classes on anything, and actually once you've defined a class, you can apply that class to all different tags. So whereas before we were just setting up the styles for, say, the body tag, in which case only the body tag can take on those styles. But with classes, with these dot class name things, we can set up styles for any bit of the text that we want. Especially when we use that span class, which allows us to sort of cut in, put a style on just one bit of text to emphasize it or to indent it, as we saw. And we saw that we can use margins to kind of shove things around on the page. Right, so we're now getting sort of quite a lot of control over the way that our pages are laid out. I think it's time to sort of revisit this idea of responsiveness. So you remember from the previous module that we said responsive means that the web page changes the way it looks depending on how wide the browser window is that someone's using to view it. So if they're on a device that has a very narrow screen, then we need to change the layout in order to make it usable on that screen. And if they've got a wider screen, then we've got more space to play with, and we can do things like have more elaborate navigation systems and that kind of thing. So I'm just going to show you the sort of a simple example of how we can make a page respond to the width of the browser, just so you get the idea of how we can implement responsiveness. Because in the following lessons, we're actually going to use a ready-made responsive library called Bootstrap. It makes it a lot easier to deal with this. But for now, let's just sort of get the basic concept of how responsiveness can be implemented in CSS with something called media queries. So here I have a simple web page with just that just displays some text. And if we look at the code, it looks like this. So we've got our HTML tag, and inside that we've got a head tag and then a body tag. And you'll see that in the head tag I'm linking to an external style sheet, and in the body tag I'm just displaying some text. And the external style sheet is currently empty. So let's just change the background color of the body just to remind ourselves how to do that. So body tag, has a background of green. Okay, save that. And if I reload, as we expect, the background goes green. However, let's say I only want it to go green if they're on a wide screen. Well, this is where the CSS media query comes in. And it looks like this. So it says at media, which if you like is notifying, say, well, I'm now going to specify sort of different activities depending on some property of the browser. Okay, so we can think of media as referring to the kind of the browser properties. Okay, and let's say I want to say if the width is at least 1,000 pixels, then I want you to set the body background color to green. Okay, so that what I've done is I've effectively kind of created another layer within my CSS. So I'm saying it's not just in every scenario the body becomes green. It's only when the browser window has a minimum width of 1,000 pixels. And this little test that we're doing here, this little test, there's all kinds of different things we can test there. And so if you want to find out more, I encourage you to go and sort of Google the CSS media query and find out different kind of tests you can do. But we're just doing the basic thing of testing whether the screen is at least 1,000 pixels wide. Okay, back to the page. Okay, so I reload the page, you can see it's now gone white. And as I drag the width of the browser window out, eventually you can see I hit 1,000 pixels in width and it goes green. And indeed, I can specify other things, right? So I can take that, copy, paste, and say, okay, so when we hit, say, 500 pixels, I want you to go red. Right, so that means if the browser window gets to at least 500 pixels, it will go red, and if it gets to at least 1,000, it will go green. And so there we are. So let's go right down to narrow window, and you see it's white, and I widen it. When I hit 500, it goes red, and when I hit 1,000, it's going green. And I'm not really programming any complex code there to do that with the JavaScript, for example, that you'll see next time. I'm just using the built-in features of CSS, which allow me to do this. And I'm just going to go one step further and show you how you can actually manipulate layout depending on the width of the window. So we saw briefly before how we can kind of use the margins and things like that to control the layout. Well, let's just do something a bit more interesting just to finish off this lesson so you can see how we can get towards making more responsive layouts. What I want to do here is actually define a new class, which is going to be, so let's just make that 750. So we'll say at 750 pixels, we want something to happen, and at 1,000 pixels, we want something else to happen. So at 750, what I'm going to do is I want to just say, well, I'm going to have two columns in my display, right? So let's start off by just doing that. And so if I do this, div like that, column 1, and then do another column and call it column 2, and just reload. You can see, let's get rid of that green stuff. Okay, so it says column 1, column 2, but they're not actually columns yet. And the idea is that when it's a really wide window, I actually want two columns, and when it slims down, I'm going to drop them into a single column. So at the moment, they're always in a single column, regardless of the size of the window. And so if I just set a class on this, I can then, now I've got a class, I can connect different CSS properties to that class depending on the size of the window. So I jump over here, and what I'm going to do is, so I'm going to say if the screen is at least 750 pixels wide, I want to redefine what responsive does, and so what we'll do is set the display to this, and I'll set the width to say 400 pixels. Okay. Okay, can you see there's two columns appearing there? And then I can finally say, well, let's say we want two narrow columns if we're in a sort of up to, if it's at least 750 wide, then we want 2 narrow columns. If it's at least 1,000, we can have 2 wider columns. Okay, so I'm saying that depending on the size of the window, I'm going to change the column layout. And there we go. So let's just see as I go really big. Oh, I've set it to 5,000. That's why it's not working. If I go really wide, you can see it jumps out to another layout there because it's making the columns wider. And to make it really kind of clear, I can just set a border on these. Okay, just so I can see exactly what the columns look like. Okay, so you can see that as the size of the window increases, suddenly it's kind of changing the way that my text is going to lay out. Right, so that's just a sort of brief introduction to how to do the most basic sort of form of a responsive design. And in the next lessons, as I say, we're going to look at the Bootstrap library, which makes it sort of much easier to do this in a really sort of smart way that's aware of all the sort of standard kind of sizes of device that people use. Okay. So you can see that we can go through and use CSS to control how the browser displays all these different elements on our page. So we've changed the way the heading is displayed. We've played around with different fonts. We've even made sort of interactive elements where when you mouse over a link, it kind of highlights it to make it really clear to the user that that link is going to go somewhere. The problem is though, there's so many different HTML tags that we could use, and the browser has a whole bunch of default settings for all of those HTML tags. And if we really want to escape from the default look that looks a bit like the world's first web page that we saw previously, if we want to escape from that and really get towards this more modern look, then we're going to have to do a lot of work in the style sheets to really style everything up. So as you might imagine, there's an easy way to do it, because obviously everybody who's made a professional website has pretty much had to do this process. So there's a whole bunch of libraries out there which basically give you ready-made sets of CSS customizations on the default way the browser displays it. And one of the more popular ones is called Bootstrap. And we're going to be using Bootstrap in the rest of this course and going into the specialization. Bootstrap's really nice because it doesn't just sort of customize the fonts and so on, it also gives you loads of ready-made kind of navigation components and different widgets that you can embed on your site. And again, we'll dig much more into those in the following course. But for now, we're just going to find out how we can install Bootstrap and then what it does to the look and feel of our site. So I'm looking at the folder containing my web files here, and the first thing I want to do is essentially get that Bootstrap file in there. So let's go. I've grabbed the Bootstrap file here, and you can access the Bootstrap CSS file online, or you can get it from our course resources. So Bootstrap CSS, there it is. Well, let's have a quick look at it. So here it is. You can see it's quite a big file, and 6,800 lines. And why is it so big? Like, as I said earlier, actually there are so many HTML tags and so many things that you can reconfigure to really get a more modern look to your site. And as Bootstrap have kind of done it all for you. And not only that, they've added extra new things which allow you to choose different ways of formatting things. So let's get this style sheet installed on our pages. So we go in, load up the pages, index.html, and instead of styles, I'm just going to load the Bootstrap file like that. Okay, and then let's load up the other ones and contact. Right, and that one is Bootstrap. Save over here. Bootstrap. And let's then reload the page and see what happens. Okay, that's kind of a transformation, right? So without the CSS. If I just remove all CSS, so basically get rid of that, it looks like this. So we've got these serif fonts, which we found out about earlier, and then we've got the kind of default link display. if I put that back in, let's just reload and see what happens. Okay, so you can see it's kind of taken, the things jumped around a bit and it's changed the padding and neutralizes the display. So you kind of got the minimum set of styles and it neutralizes it to quite a sort of modern look. And you can see it's taken the serif font and replaced it with a sans serif. There's no wiggly bits on the end of the S. And again for the links as well. And the links are now, they've got a default sort of dynamic behavior. So instead of having the underline there all the time, it just pops up when you mouse over them. Okay, so that's the simplest thing that Bootstrap can do for us, and that's how to install the Bootstrap library. So in the next lesson, we're going to see sort of one of the extra things that Bootstrap gives us, which is the grid, and this is where our website starts becoming really responsive. So I'll see you in the next lesson. Right, so we've added Bootstrap to our site and we've neutralized all of those sort of default styles that the browser applies and applied a sort of more modern set of default styles using that library. What we're going to do now is use another aspect of Bootstrap, which is allows us to very easily create what we call responsive layouts. And so we're just going to get a bit of an intro to responsive layouts now, but if you go to the second course, in this specialisation, we sort of deal with responsive layouts in a little bit more depth and explain more how you can gain control over those. But for now, let's just sort of get a brief idea of how they work. So the basic idea is that I have a grid like this, and I think of my web page as being a grid which has 12 columns in like that. So you've got 1 through 12. And if I've got some content on my web page, I can choose how much of that grid it takes up. So I might want, say, I might want to have, say, two panels which take up 6 grid squares each, for example. So let's say I decided I want, the design for my web page is going to be 2 panels, and each of those panels, therefore, is going to take up half of the complete space. So that would take up 6 grid spaces per panel. And how do we write that in code in Bootstrap? Well, let's just go through and sort of code that up. All right, so first thing is, there's my sort of neutralized Bootstrap web page, and the code is here. So I've got the index file, and I'm going to start just by editing index and sort of creating 2 panels to show you how that works. And I do that by, first of all, you wrap everything in div tags in Bootstrap, so you'll get used to writing the div tag really quickly the more Bootstrap you do, because you're going to write a lot of them. And the div tag is a sort of interesting tag in HTML. It isn't really used to sort of signify that anything has any particular purpose. It's more used to separate different parts of the document so that you can deal with them in different ways, for example in your CSS. So unlike an H1 tag, which means this is a heading, or an A tag, which means this is a link, a div tag doesn't really instruct the browser to do anything in particular. It's a way of us connecting maybe a set of CSS styles to a particular thing, or sort of showing and hiding different bits of our page. And so in Bootstrap they use divs for really structuring things and applying different styles. And the style we want to apply here is the concept that this div, so this page, is going to have sort of two columns. All right, and so first of all we wrap everything in a container div, which does this. You see it moved the page across a bit, and now we're using the sort of proper Bootstrap layout. And then we create another div which has the class of row, and row signifies one of these things here. Okay, that's a row, and inside the row we're going to create another div, and the class of this div is going to be col md6. Okay, and I can put some content here. For panel 1, for panel 2. So effectively what I've done there is I've defined two panels, one of which is taking up 6 and the other one of which is taking up 6 as well. So there we have it, 2 6 wide. So 6 just signifies how many of these kind of grid squares this panel takes up. And you can see we've got a row and then columns inside the row. And we can have as many rows and columns as we like, as long as we sort of consider the fact that each row has to add up to 12 columns in total. So let's have a look at that page. Okay, so you can see that one panel's gone there and one panel's gone there. And if we want to really clearly see what's going on, let's just draw a border around those two things so that we can see what they're doing. So I'm going to define a new style called which gives a border to things. So I'm going to put my old style sheet back in. Okay, so I'm back in the head part of the document here, and my style sheet is called styles.css. So you can see you can actually include lots of style sheets. It's fine, you can add as many as you like. And the idea of that is that they cascade into each other. So the Bootstrap CSS, we looked at that earlier, and it had loads and loads of different styles. So that's our starting set of styles. And then we add styles.css to that. And if it has any things that have the same class, then it will override what's going on. So each style sheet you add can kind of override things that happened in the previous style sheet, or indeed add new ones. And again, that's quite a common thing. So you might start with a default style sheet and then modify it a bit. So when we're modifying the way that Bootstrap displays things, we'll put that in a separate file. We don't edit Bootstrap CSS. Okay, so there's style CSS, and first let's open up style CSS. And drop it into the text editor there. And I don't need any of these styles anymore because I'm now letting Bootstrap style up my page, but I would like to create a new class called thin border, right? And thin border is just going to create a border on whatever you set it to. So border 1 pixel solid black. Okay, so that will create a thin border on whatever you set it to. So then I can go into here. So just reminding you of the syntax there. So full stop thin border means I'm defining a new CSS class, and then everything in the brackets, that's the CSS class properties. Okay, and then I can put a comment in to just explain what it's doing. Use this to put borders around things. Okay, so that's a CSS comment. So you notice that there's different types of comments for CSS and HTML. Okay, then I just need to add that class. So it's called thin border, right? And that's my custom class. And then when I reload the page, I should now see that I've got a border, right? So I just added a border around so I could see the layout. And so let's just sort of play around with that a bit. What happens if maybe one of them was 3 and one of them was 9? So if we think about the grid, then that's the equivalent of shrinking that one down to 3 and putting that one up to 9. So it should look something like this, right? So let's go back. There we are. So now we've got that one's sort of shortened and that one's bigger. So that we can control sort of how much of the grid. As long as it adds up to 12, it's fine. So the last thing I sort of want to see is what happens when someone looks at this on a browser with a different size window. And that's responsive, right? That's the responsive thing. Because you can see this page is quite wide. And imagine looking at that on a phone. It's going to be difficult because you have to kind of pull it across and go over there. You've probably done that if you tried to, book tickets on one of those old websites where they haven't updated it properly yet and you're kind of sweeping around all over the place. Well, responsive is a solution to that. So let's see what happens when I simulate looking at this on a thinner browser. Right, there you go. So did you see what happened? You can see there's kind of several steps where it kind of lays out the page in a slightly different way. And so at one point it steps down and boink, it goes down to two rows instead. And that's built into the sort of gridding functionality that we get with Bootstrap, the idea that the grid automatically lays itself out properly. And so now if I'm looking at that on a phone, my grid, it doesn't look exactly how I laid it out, but it means it's more usable on the phone. It's making the best possible use of that kind of long and thin display. Okay, so that's our first real bit of responsive web programming. So well done to get this far, and please go and try those code examples out for yourself. You're doing great. You've picked up 2 languages now, HTML and CSS, so you can build basic websites with links between them, pages, and you can use CSS to control the look and feel of your websites. But what's coming up in the next module, Marco?
We're going to look at the third important language of web development, JavaScript, which is going to allow you to take your websites and make them more interactive. So looking forward to seeing you in the first lesson of the next module. Welcome back. You've already learned a lot about HTML and CSS. Now we're going to look at JavaScript, which will let you create interactive websites that can respond in real time to user input. Okay, welcome back. You've now spent a couple of weeks working on the fundamentals of creating web pages, and this week we're going to move on to the next stage, which is interactivity. But to sort of introduce that, I'd like to sort of think a little bit about the kind of web pages you've been creating. So if you think about what happens when you load a web page, you're at your computer, this person on the left, and you're, for example, visiting the Coursera page. I represent by the Coursera logo, but this is the server that hosts the Coursera web page. What happens on the kind of page that we've been creating so far is that you type in a URL and send that request, and then the server finds the HTML page and the CSS and any of the images and sends it back to you. And that's the basic interaction we've been working on. Send a request and a whole page gets sent back to you. And, you know, that's perfectly good, and that's well represents, you know, what web pages are like in the mid-90s, but a modern web page is actually far more interactive than that. Once you've loaded a page like the Coursera web page that you're on now, in fact what happens is you spend a lot of time interacting. You will click on a video to make it play, and that the web page will respond by playing the video, or similarly, you might sort of click on a tab and it'll show you more information. You might hover over something and it'll show you a tooltip. There's lots of sort of constant little bits of activity that interacting directly with the web page in the browser. So these things aren't, well, most of them aren't sending requests back to the server and loading new pages. They're sort of changing and manipulating the page you've got. And that's the kind of interactivity I'd like to talk to you today. And in particular, I'll focus on sort of the kind of interactivity you do with mouse clicks, so sort of clicking on elements or possibly hovering over elements. So this kind of interactivity is enabled by a third language called JavaScript. So we've already looked at 2 of the main web languages, HTML in the first module, CSS in the second module. JavaScript is the third language. If HTML is for the structure of a web page, CSS is for the style of a web page, well, JavaScript is for interactivity, and actually we'll discover it's for many other things as we go throughout the course. It's possibly the most complex of the 3 web languages, but for now we'll use it for interactivity. So if you're new to programming, JavaScript is probably the hardest of the 3 languages to come, because it really is a full programming language. And I'll try to introduce things from the very beginning. Compared to many other programming languages, it isn't so complex, but we've also included some links to further materials if you feel you need some extra reading or extra support for learning JavaScript. On the other hand, if you are an existing programmer, there are a few things I'd like to point out. So many of you might have started programming with a language called Java, have experience with Java. And if you're in that position, the one thing I really want to stress is that JavaScript is not Java. Though the names are similar, actually they're very different languages. So JavaScript came out at about the same time as Java was quite a sort of exciting new language, and as a marketing spin, they sort of tried to align it with Java. And in fact, JavaScript isn't really the official name. The official name is ECMAScript. But why I'm stressing this is that actually, even though JavaScript has a very similar syntax to Java, it's actually a very different language. A lot of the principles of JavaScript underline them are very different conceptually for how things work in Java, and in fact in many other languages such as C, Ruby, Python, etc. So throughout this course I'll point out a number of moments where we'll be doing something in JavaScript which seems really, really strange to somebody with a background in Java or most other programming languages, but is perfectly fine JavaScript. So even if you're used to programming in another language, there is still quite a few things to learn, and I will try my best to highlight them wherever possible. So now we know what we need to do. In the next video I'll start taking you through the very basics of writing some interactive JavaScript. So in the last lecture we talked about why we need JavaScript and how it gives interactivity. Now I'd like to take the first steps in creating an interactive web page. So if you look at this web page, it's as simple as it can possibly be in terms of HTML and layout. It's just, one H1 tag. But the thing I'm adding here is the ability to click on this tag. So there's nothing special about it. It's not a button. It's just an H1 with some text in. But if I click on it, something happens. It brings up this little alert saying hello. So this is very, very simple interactivity, but it requires us to look at a number of things, looking at events and JavaScript. So what's happening when I'm doing this click is that the web browser is creating an event. So something has happened that we need to respond to. That event is called a click event because I have clicked the mouse. And if we want to do something based on that event, we need to create a little bit of code, a little script, which will tell us what to do when we respond to that event. And I'll show you how to do that. So this is the simplest possible way of responding to an event. This is an H1 tag. It is simply some HTML that we've seen before, but we've got a new attribute here, and this is the attribute called onClick. OnClick is a bit of code. The value of the attribute is a bit of code that happens when the element is clicked. So this is telling the browser what it needs to do when we've receive a click event on this HTML element. And the content of the attribute, the value, is a script. So while everything else on this slide is HTML, this little bit is our first bit of JavaScript. And this is what is actually making that little dialog window appear. So let's look a little bit more closely at what the script is doing and what it looks like. First thing to note, it looks quite different from HTML. So JavaScript is a different looking language from HTML, and the syntax, the punctuation is different. So it's quite easy to tell what is JavaScript and what is HTML. There are various bits here. The first thing I'll say is what is this thing alert? Alert is a function. It's like a command. We're asking JavaScript to do something for us. And we're telling them what we want to be done is we want an alert. And an alert, that function, what it does is simply create a little alert box, a little dialog that pops up, as we've seen when I showed you the original web page. But it's just one example of a possible function. We can have many other functions that do many other things, and we'll see many of those over the course of this MOOC. So what's everything else? So alert is the function, that's what we want it to do. What is everything else? The next thing is this hello thing. This is an argument. An argument is something that changes what the function does, or tells the function how to do what it's doing. So creating an alert is one thing, you pop up the dialog box, but not all alerts are the same. The main thing that we want different about alerts is different alerts should say different things. And so the main thing we want to change about the alert is the text that goes on that dialog box. So our argument is changing that text. In this example here, the argument is hello, and that hello is in quotes. The reason it's in quotes is because to say this is some text. It's not the name of a tag or the name of a function. It's just simply the text hello that we want to display on screen. Then we've got a bunch of punctuation, and this is really, really important. As we've already seen in HTML, the sort of the punctuation, what we call the syntax, like the angle brackets, are key parts of the language that are really important. The computer needs those to know what to do. And because computers are basically pretty stupid, they can't really cope if we get the punctuation wrong. So getting all this syntax right is absolutely critical. Now, in this case, we've got these two brackets. They're standard sort of parentheses. What these are telling us, this is the start and the end of the argument of the function. And as we'll get used to functions, these two parentheses are really what defines a function, as opposed to other things in JavaScript. And then we've got this semicolon. What's that for? That's basically saying this is the end of this line of code. So we've done one thing, end that, and then we can move on to other things. In this case, we're only doing one thing. We're only bringing up an alert, so it's not so critical that we have this semicolon. But it's very important to get used to putting semicolons, because the minute you start doing another thing after this code, you will need that semicolon to end this command and start the next command. It's a very important part of writing more complex programs than that. So let's have a look at the entire HTML file. Very, very simple HTML. I've got nothing in the head, and my body just consists of this H1. As I said, it looks a lot like the HTML you've seen so far in this course, apart from this on-click, which is exactly what I've just showed you. And just to return to the web page, to remind us what we do, we have this hello, this H1, and when we click on it, it brings up an alert. So there you go, you've got the basic sort of interactivity. We have an interactive web page. We can click on it, it does stuff without having to do page reloads. This is an enormously powerful technique. This video, we've only just scratched the surface, and in the next few videos, I'll take you through some more interactive techniques we can use. So we've got our first interactive web page in the last video. Now I want to start taking you through other interactive techniques. Now in this video I'm going to show you something very useful that is not so much for the displaying the web page itself, but it's a very useful thing when you're programming to be able to find out what your program's doing and quickly test stuff in a complex program. And it's something called the console. So if we look at our browser, Matthew has probably already shown you some of the developer tools. So if we open up View Developer JavaScript Console, I'm using Chrome here. There's some things that in each browser has something different. I would advise using Chrome for this MOOC, just so you're using the same thing, but you can look up the documentation of your browser if you really want to use a different browser. View Developer JavaScript Console. Matthew has shown you something similar to this, where you can sort of get underneath the hood of the web page. But this is quite a useful bit. This part of it is where you can actually send messages out, sort of print stuff out, in order to see what's going on in your program. So what I'm going to do here is actually type some code in. So you can actually type JavaScript in here. Don't worry too much about what this is saying. For now, I'll go through this in a lot of detail. But if I type that in, it says hello back to me. It prints that out back to the console, which is fine in itself, but actually it becomes very useful when you can start getting your web page to do something similar. So what I now want to do is load a different version of this web page where it's still the same page, it's still got the same H1, but clicking on it does something different. And what it does is it prints hello to the console. You'll see as I print it multiple times to save space, because it's exactly the same thing. It's not printing it out again, it's just counting the number of times I've printed it. So let's have a quick look at this code. It, again, is pretty much the same as last time, except we've got something else in our onClick, and it's called console.log. And I want to talk a little bit about what exactly that means. Before I start looking at the syntax, I want to talk very briefly about sort of the bits that can make up a web page. In the previous example we showed you an alert. An alert is just an alert, it's not part of the web page. But most of what you're doing when you're web programming is actually about interacting with specific things in your browser or web page. So at the highest level, you've got a browser window, which is everything in your particular window or tab, everything that relates to your web page. Within that window, you've got your actual document. So this is the actual HTML that you're currently displaying. And that document consists of a number of elements. This simple document consists of one element, this is H1. But there are other things in the window as well. And the thing we just looked at is the console. So we can also interact with stuff that is not part of our document, but part of the whole browser window. Each of these things is what we call an object. So that's something that we can interact with via JavaScript. And that sort of interacting with individual objects underlies the vast majority of what we're going to do in JavaScript. So I want to just show you an outline of how you do that. So this is the line of code that we put in our latest page. It looks quite similar to the alert we had last time. We're calling a function just like the alert. So this log is calling a function. It's got an argument hello, very similar to alert. But we've got this other thing. We've got this console. And that, as we saw, is an object that represents the console bit of the web page. So we're calling this function on this particular object. And that's important because it now ties functionality to things. We're not calling it on the window, we're not calling it on the document or an HTML element, we're calling it on an object. But we could very easily, and we will in the next few videos, call functionality on particular HTML elements as well. This particular functionality is being called on the console. And the last thing I want to point out is this dot. That's really important. That's what links between the object and the function we're calling on that object. So we always need to put a dot to join those two things together. This is quite a simple line of code, but as I said, it does underlie everything we're going to do in the next few videos. In fact, the rest of the specialization, because most of the time we're going to be manipulating things in our web page. And as we look at the next videos, we're going to see how that most of the time we're going to want to manipulate elements and attributes and things like that. And this technique is what we're going to use. But console.log is a very simple way of doing that. To recap then, if I reload the page, every time I click here, we're doing this console log. And it's a good illustration of what I wanted to show, which is calling functions on objects, but it's also a very useful thing. As you're developing web pages and testing them, a really nice way of sort of starting out testing is to print stuff out to the console before you do more complex JavaScript operations. So in a sense, this is why I wanted to show it to you first, because this is the way I would naturally start coding. So, I've got to respond to a mouse click. Well, before I do all the complicated things I really want to happen, let's just make sure I can get that mouse click out by printing to the console, because I know that always works. And then when I do some sort of more complex manipulation of the HTML elements, I know that at least receiving the mouse click doesn't work, so if I don't see anything, it's the fault of the HTML manipulation code, not my mouse click code. So I would always sort of make good use of the console as a debugging technique. So with that, I think we're now ready in the next video to start properly looking at how to manipulate your web page and create a truly interactive web page. Hello, we've started to look at JavaScript. We've got the basic concepts and we're creating little bits of interactivity, but all our interactivity has basically been showing alerts or printing stuff out to the console. None of it has actually done anything to the web page itself. Now, what I want to start on today is looking at how we actually manipulate the elements of the HTML to sort of change what they're doing. So let's look at a very simple example. Back to our sort of world's most basic web page. We've got our hello, and I'm going to click on this again. And this time, rather than bringing out an alert or printing something out, I've actually changed the HTML element. The text of the H1 has gone from being hello to being goodbye. Still pretty basic, but actually it's a massive leap in terms of what we can do, because it shows that we can now start to change the web page in real time based on users' interaction without having to reload the web page. So let's have a look at how we do that. So this is the script. It's starting to get a little bit more complex. And the first thing I want to point out is this, and I'll explain what it is. Now, JavaScript has a lot of built-in functionality that allows you to manipulate the web page, but sometimes it's not the easiest to use. And in fact, most people who write a lot of JavaScript don't use directly the built-in JavaScript functionality. They use what we call libraries, so existing sets of code that are built on top of JavaScript and provide easier functionality and sort of extra bits of functionality than the language itself. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to use a library called jQuery. What does that mean? All it really is it's just another bit of JavaScript, a very big and complex bit of JavaScript, but another bit of JavaScript that you can add to your web page, and that gives you a lot of power, lots of extra bits of code that you can access, and it makes it easy for you to manipulate the web page as you want to. So that's what we have here. This line here is simply adding in jQuery, our this library. It's a JavaScript file. The tag is called a script tag. We'll see that later, but what this particular script tag is doing is just bringing in some extra JavaScript and adding it to the web page. And the most important, the main attribute, well, the only attribute we've got here is this source attribute. That's similar to the source attribute of an image, so we're getting an external file. But in this case, what we have is not an image file, but a JS file, which means it's JavaScript. I'm loading it from a web page, so this is the permanent hosted version of jQuery, so you can just download it all the time without having to include it in your own sites. But sometimes you might want to include it in your own sites, in which case you don't bother with the full URL, you just have it there, but you need to make sure that this file, a copy of this file, is on your server. The only thing I'll say here is that we've got this min thing. Well, actually, I'll look at the full title to just explain it a bit. It's called jQuery. That's the name of the library. You'll see that a lot. This bit is the version. It's actually very important to be aware of the version of the library you're using. It's constantly updating and changing. So if you want to really control and know that it works and that some new version hasn't changed the functionality and broken your code, you need to make sure you're looking at a specific version. So this was the latest version at the time I wrote this a couple of weeks ago, and so by the time you're doing this course, there'll probably be a newer, updated version. And this bit here is min. That means it's minified. What that means is that JavaScript files can become quite big, and as you write JavaScript, just as you write HTML, you might leave some space, put in some carriage returns to make it easy to read. That's all very good practice to make great readable code, but it does increase the file size. So there's this special program which will take JavaScript, which is nicely formatted and readable, and crunch it down by reducing all the white space, shortening the variable name so it's as small as it can possibly be. So once we've got this library installed, then we can access functionality in this library. And this is what we're doing down here. Just as we have with our previous examples, we've got our on-click attribute, and we've got some code, a line of code in that on-click attribute. And this is some code that's using jQuery. And I want to go through that in quite a lot of detail. So here is that line of jQuery code, and I'll explain it bit by bit. The first thing to note is this $sign. This $sign is actually shorthand for jQuery. You could actually write out jQuery, but most people don't. It's just a shorthand. It just makes it a very short, simple thing to type. It doesn't make your code overly long. And this shorthand is what it is it's actually a function. And we can kind of tell it's a function because it's got brackets and an argument. So it actually looks like the function's. The only thing that makes it look strange is it's got this odd name, a $sign. But the $sign is a valid name for a function. The argument to the function is actually a CSS selector. So if you remember from the last module, a CSS selector is a way of accessing certain elements of a web page. And in this case, we're using the hash or £, and that means it's the ID of a particular element. So we're selecting an element by an ID, and we can see that we've given our H1 the ID title. Now, jQuery supports any kind of CSS selector, so you could select it by a particular tag type like H1 or a particular class. But if you want one specific element accessed, then you would normally use an ID. Then we're calling a function HTML. Now this is like we saw in the last video. We're calling a function on an object. In the last video, that object, we had the name of the object console. In this case, the object is actually what the function is returning to us. So that function hash title, that gives us an object which represents the HTML tag. So we've actually got the HTML tag back, and what that allows us to do is call a function on HTML. And what that function is called HTML. What that means is that we're changing the HTML body of the element. So all of the HTML code that's contained in that element is being changed. Now, at the moment, that is just some text. It's just hello, but it could have further tags in it, including other tags. And finally, we've got an argument to this function HTML, and that is what we want to set the HTML content of the tag to. So we're going to change the HTML content of the tag, and we want to change it to goodbye. Again, I could include tags in there. I could include a link, for example, but at the moment it's just text. So we're getting rid of the old content of the tag, and we're putting in goodbye. So we're replacing it. So that's what this line of code does. It uses jQuery to grab hold of our HTML element and calls a function which changes the content of that HTML element, and it changes it to goodbye because that's the argument of our function. And just to look at that again, if I refresh, when I click, it changes to goodbye. And to look at it in context again, just to remind ourselves where it is, we're putting that in the on-click, so it's responding to on-click. So we've now, in this video, made a big leap forward. We can now really create interactive web pages where the content of the web page changes as you interact with it and responds to user interaction. This is a very, very powerful feature, and basically for the rest of this MOOC and for large chunks of the following specialization, we're going to make use of this in order to create rich interactive web experiences. Hello again. So in the last video we showed you the really important technique that makes it possible to change the web page in response to user clicks and user interaction. So that's really powerful, but to make full use of it we really want to be able to write quite complex programs, and so far all we've done, each of the little bits of JavaScript we've done has only ever done one thing. We want complex JavaScript that can do many things in response to users. So I want to look at how we can restructure our web pages to allow us to use more complex JavaScript. So why can't we do that? Let's recap what we've done before. So we've got our HTML tag, which has got our on-click attribute, and we've got a script in here. If we want to make the script more complex, we need to add more and more JavaScript. But it's going to look really sort of clunky to have a load of JavaScript inside a single HTML attribute. We really want to be able to sort of expand that out. We want to have actually a lot of space to write sort of really quite complex JavaScript code that has many lines, and we can and that does many things. And we want to be able to lay it out nicely so we can read it well, and it's all very clear. And putting it inside an attribute just doesn't allow us to do that very well. So I'm going to show you something else. So in the last lecture we actually already had a look at the script tag, and I'm going to use that in a different way. So last time we used the script tag to bring in a JavaScript library to sort of import jQuery so we could use it in our code. In this time we're going to use the script tag to start creating our own code. So here it is what the script tag looks like. It's called script. It has a type. That's really important. The type of this script is text/JavaScript. What that means is the script consists of text. I mean, it's typewritten text, and that text is a JavaScript program. And most of the time when we're working with scripts, they will be JavaScript, but actually in the next MOOC of this specialization we'll see an example where it isn't JavaScript. And then inside this tag we have the actual script itself. So this is actual JavaScript code. This is exactly the same JavaScript code we saw in the last video. So if we look at what this actually does, let's grab the script here called script tag and load it up. It just loads. I mean, you didn't really even see that. Let's reload the previous page and load it. It loads the page and it immediately changes the hello to goodbye. So it immediately runs that code. Let's have a look at what that's doing and why it is. As usual, we're going to import jQuery. We'll do that. We'll always do that in future. We've got our body, but it no longer has an on-click attribute. The code is no longer attached to this element. And down here we've got this script tag. And that's changing the value of the HTML element. And what it's doing is it's changing that. It runs that script as soon as the web page loads. So that's why it's immediately changing it. It's no longer attached to a particular sort of event. It's just there. It's just running that script. That isn't really what we want to do. I mean, we still want to be able to respond to events, but respond in a script tag. And so actually, although the script tag does make it easier to separate out the script and the HTML, and I hope you'll agree that code I showed you is clearer and more readable because the HTML elements are more self-contained and the script elements are more self-contained. We've lost the ability to respond to the event. So we need to link those two things back together, and I'll show you how to do that. The main thing we're going to want to do is start by go back to the very first thing we did when we started on JavaScript, which is look at calling a function. The first bit of JavaScript we had is calling this function alert, which triggered with the command hello. And the way we did that is we included that in an on-click event in our HTML. And that was fine, but as it got more complex, it got more and more sort of clunky to fit that into the on-click. So what I'm going to do now is show you how to take that long complex code and create our own function that we can then call in a much more simple way in the on-click. So this is a very powerful technique because it allows us to bundle together bits of code and really quite complex code, but then call it very simply just with that simplicity we had of calling the alert function in the first place. So it simplifies and streamlines the code. So I'm going to replace the alert we've got in that on-click with a more complex function that I've written myself. So this is what my function looks like. I've called it say hello, and it's got various bits, and I'll take you through each bit of it one by one. So this is, if in the previous slide we saw how to call a function with alert, this is how to create our own function that we can call just as we called alert, one of the built-in functions of JavaScript. So, anything we can do, with built-in functions in JavaScript, we can extend by creating our own functions. The first thing we have here is this word function. And this, you need to have exactly the word function to tell JavaScript that what you're doing now is a function. So it knows what you're doing. The next thing we have here is the function name. I'll call it say hello. Let's just remember that the function, when we call it, the first thing we need is the name of the function so that we can actually call that function. So that's a really important part of the function. And as we see, that's the first thing we get. And then we'll note that the other big part we need is the arguments. So we have the function name, and in here, inside these brackets, which look the same as the previous one, we have the arguments. But actually, we don't have any arguments here, so the brackets are empty. We still need the brackets. We still need the brackets to tell JavaScript that there are no arguments, but in this case, we can have empty brackets to say we don't have any arguments, we don't care about the arguments. So we've got the two components that we've seen before when we're calling the alert function, the name of the function and the arguments. But we need one more thing, which is the actual code that we want to run when JavaScript calls our function. And this is the code, the body, the content of the function. It's just a bunch of JavaScript code. In this case, it's that one line of JavaScript code that I've shown you in the previous video. And these bits are really important. So we've got a new type of brackets, these curly brackets. So we'll see that different types of brackets are very important throughout web programming. So in HTML, we've got these angle brackets. To call a function, we've got these kind of standard curved parentheses. We've got these curly brackets here. And what these are doing, they're telling us what the start and the end of the body of the function is. So this is the start and the end of the code. And once we've got the second curly brackets, we know that our function is over. We've finished our code. And then once we've got that function, we can call it in the same way as our on-click function here, as we've seen before. And I'll show you that in a more full web page example. So this is a complete web page that does that. And down here inside our script tag, we're defining our function. It's got all the elements I just told you about. In this case, it's just calling alert, actually. So it's not really doing anything new. But we're essentially giving it another name that we can call up here. So while this function is still very small and we're not actually really gaining anything from putting it in a function, we can actually, once we've got it in this form, we can add lots and lots of more code to make it far more complex, which is something we'll do over the next few videos. But the important thing to note is, in our on-click, we're calling our new function name, say hello, not a built-in function, not something that's provided by JavaScript, but something we have created that allows us to add our own functionality to an on-click. And let's have a look at that back on the web page. And when we click on hello, it gives us the alerts. Nothing new in terms of functionality, but we've created a new structure for the web page that allow us to add more and more complex functionality and make it easier to write complex interactive web pages. We're now creating some interactive web pages, and let's have a look back at the kind of page we've created. So, as we saw, we've got this HTML element, and we can now respond to clicks on it. So when I click it, it changes to goodbye. But actually, there's a slight problem. When I click it again, it just stays at goodbye. I might want it to do something else. I might want it to switch back, for example. And why is it doing that? Well, it's not that it isn't responding to mouse clicks. What it's doing is that every time I'm clicking the mouse on this, it's changing the text of this element to goodbye, because that's what my function does. It changes it to goodbye. But if it's already goodbye, it's not actually changing it. It's just taking goodbye and replacing it with goodbye. What we'd like to be able to do is to do, if the text is already goodbye, to do something different. And there are a number of ways of doing that, but one way of doing that is actually change the functionality of my JavaScript at the same time as I change the text. So when I change from hello to goodbye, I actually want to change my function as well, so that I'm changing from a function that sets it to goodbye to a function that sets it to hello. So how can we go about making that change? Actually, JavaScript has some really nice features for enabling us to do that. So let's just remind ourselves again. We've got our on-click event, which has got an associated function, and we can define that in the HTML tag. But there's actually another way of doing it, which is that we can use jQuery and JavaScript to change what happens when we click on an element. So what we've got here is, as we've seen in previous videos, we've got jQuery, we're getting hold of that element, and we're calling a function on it. But this is a new function. Last time we changed, we called the HTML function, which changes the content. This function is click, which changes the on-click function, so what happens when you click it. This is a really nice feature of JavaScript, because you're not just changing the content, you can just, in the same way you can change the content, you can change the functionality of a particular HTML element, so that as your interaction with the program evolves, you can change what the web page actually does. This is really powerful. Now, the thing that enables that is actually this. The fact that we can, instead of passing in some text to a function called click, we can actually pass in another function. This is something that might sort of seem a little bit odd to people with a Java background. This is not the kind of thing you do in Java or even Python. But actually it's really core to how JavaScript works. And this is one of the sort of the big differences that I mentioned at the start of this module. That, actually it's a very fundamentally different language to one like Java. And one of the reasons for that is that unlike Java, where sort of functions are a special thing, in JavaScript functions are just objects, things like anything else, and you can pass them into functions. You can do anything that you can do to a piece of text, almost you can do to a function. So, and as we'll see in the future, this is a really powerful technique because it makes it very easy to do the kinds of things we're going to do, which is changing the functionality associated with an element, as well as many, many more complex techniques, which we'll learn over the course of this specialization. So here's, we're passing in a function to our click. In many ways, it's like any other function, but the thing to note is it doesn't have a name. We're just calling it function without the name. And we don't need a name in this case because we're never actually calling it again. We're just passing it into onClick, and it's never being used anywhere else. So we don't need to give it a name. And this is something called an anonymous function because it doesn't have a name. And this is something that's used throughout JavaScript. Again, it seems very strange to a Java programmer, but in JavaScript, this is a really core functionality where we just create a function on the fly and pass it into another function. So we're passing it into click, and it's changing the functionality of the click button, but it's now, we don't have to explicitly call it again, we don't have to give it a name, it's just created for the sole purpose of passing it into this function. And as you see, we're defining the function, we're giving all of the function directly inside the brackets which define the arguments of click. So let's look at the rest of this. We have the body of this function. The body of this function is, as I said, defined directly inside the parentheses, the brackets, which are containing the arguments of click. And we can put whatever code we like in it. And very strange to someone from many other programming languages, but very much the way JavaScript works. And you see this kind of way of writing throughout JavaScript's code. And just I'd like to look at this sort of the last line here, because it's actually got a lot of complex syntax punctuation. We need a curly bracket to end the function. Here we're ending the arguments to click, so this is ending our call to click, and we're ending the line. And so these three slightly odd sort of bits of punctuation are at the end, and you'll see that a lot again. And I'll also want to point out this last line of the function. The first line of the body of the function is just doing what we've done before, changing the HTML. There's an important difference, of course. We're changing it back to hello this time rather than changing it to goodbye, but otherwise it's the same. What's this line doing? It's title.offClick. What it's doing, it's another function on the same HTML elements, but what we're doing is we're turning off some functionality in the click functionality. The reason we want to do that is once we've clicked and changed it back to hello, we want to go back to the beginning of the program. We want to get rid of this special new function we've added to click. So we just turn it off again, and it will revert back to the old function that was there before. In fact, that old function never really went away. It's just this function is overwriting it. Let's look at that in a full web page. So as usual in the head, we're loading up jQuery. That's the same as ever. We've got our h1 tag that we're manipulating, and we've got in our onClick we're calling say goodbye. That's a function that we've created ourselves, and it's down here in the script tag. And this is function, it's actually a lot more complex than we've seen before, and this is where we're starting to see the benefit of separating our code off into a script tag with its own function, because now we can have lots of lines of code that really wouldn't fit very well inside this attribute. So the first line is just the same as ever. We're changing the HTML to goodbye, and then the next line is this click function, which I've just described to you, where we're changing the click functionality, and the two things we're doing there are kind of the mirror image of what we're doing in say goodbye. We're switching the title back to hello, and then we're turning off this new click functionality, so we go back to the old click functionality, which is calling say goodbye. So there we are. We're starting to build up some more complex JavaScript programs. Let's see what that actually does. When I click hello, it changes to goodbye, and this time when I click goodbye, it changes back to hello. And it's always flipping back and forward between those two things. So we've got some nice new, more complex functionality. So that's good. So we've got the ability to not only change what the web page looks like, but change what the web page does based on user interactions. And that's really powerful because it allows us to turn on and off bits of functionality, reveal bits of content, but those contents don't have to be just static text, static HTML. They can be interactive content where we're creating new bits of functionality as we reveal and add new bits of code. So this is, as I said, powerful technique that we're going to use a lot over the course of the rest of this MOOC and this specialization. And we've done a lot in this this week, in this module. We've gone from the most basic bits of functionality to really quite sophisticated use of JavaScript anonymous functions. In the last video of this series, I'm just going to quickly show you a slightly more rounded, complex example of how to use that. Hello, this module we've been learning a lot about interactivity and using JavaScript to allow users to directly manipulate the web page through mouse clicks, etc. But we've used quite small examples. It's pretty simple web pages. There's nothing like a real web page. So I'd like to end this module by looking at a bigger example that really starts to look like the kind of website you'd want to build. This is an example of an image gallery website. It's based on the code that Matthew showed you last week, but I've added some images, and you can see there are 4 images at the top and 1 at the bottom. So these 4 are like thumbnails. This one at the bottom is like the principal image. And what I'd like to take you through in this video is giving some interactivity to this site so that when you click on one of the thumbnails, it brings that image up. So I'll take you through the code of this. It's based on the outline that Matthew showed last week. So we've got various style sheets, jQuery as usual, a little bit of header navigation info, and then we have the main sort of Bootstrap elements, and we're using a grid layout as you did in the last module, and we've got a row, which is a row of the 4 thumbnails. Each of these is one of the columns, and a second row is the big image here. So we've got this large image with ID big image and class large image. That class corresponds to CSS here, which gives it margin and just the size. Similarly, the thumbnails have this class crop image, which has its own CSS, which makes it slightly smaller. So this is showing you how to take some of the Bootstrap grid layout kind of stuff you've learned last week and put it into a slightly more real website, a sort of image gallery website. But now we want to take it one step further and make that interactive. The interactivity happens in this script here. And as you can see, it's actually quite a simple script, but I'd like to sort of unpack it in a lot more detail. So the basic thing that this script is doing is looking for on-click function events on the small images, and when an on-click event happens, put them on the big image. And we're trying to avoid having to rewrite the code for every single thumbnail image. We want just one bit of code for all of the thumbnails, and so that it can get it right. And there are a number of features that we're going to use in JavaScript that enable us to do that. So this is the code. The first thing that we see is that we're using, as usual, jQuery, and this time we're not getting by ID, but we're getting by class. So we're using the dot, which is the class of the CSS selector, and that means that we can, at the same time, get all of the images which are tagged with class crop image, which is all our thumbnails. So up to now we've been thinking about jQuery getting for each jQuery element call we're getting a single element, but actually jQuery works just as well for getting multiple elements, and if you call a function on those multiple elements, it applies to all of them. The function we're calling is click. We've seen that before. That sets a function that happens on a click event. So just as we've seen in the last video. And then down here we have the actual code. We've got this jQuery selector that grabs the main image, the big image. And we've got another jQuery function here which sets an attribute of big image. So just as we can set an event function or the content, we can also set values of the attribute. And the attr function, attr, is a function which will set an attribute or get an attribute value. Here we're calling it the first argument we're passing in is source, so we're setting the attribute source, the source file of the image. And we've got a second attribute as well, which is this one, which is the actual value we want to put into the source image. Now, we don't know what that value is straight away. We're waiting. It depends on which of the images we're clicked. And because we're only calling this code once for all of the images, then we're going to have to figure out which image it is before we do anything with it. So we can't just type in the value. We have to get it from the image. And this code is doing a bunch of those things. First off, it's using the same attr function, attribute function of jQuery, instead of to set the attribute, to get the attribute. So we're doing attr source. And then we're doing it to an object called this. So instead of passing in a class selector, an ID selector, we've got this thing, this. What exactly is that? Well, it's a slightly complicated JavaScript feature, but in this context, when you've got an event, you're calling a click event, this is what we call a variable. Its value is set to whatever HTML element was clicked on or the event was called on. So in the context we're looking at here, we're clicking on one of the images, and this will be that particular image tag that we've just clicked on. So we can see here that we pass that into jQuery to turn into a jQuery object, and the call attribute on it. We're getting the source attribute of the image we've clicked on. That is the actual file that's attached to the image we're clicked on. And we're then setting the source attribute of the big image to be the same as the small image. That has the effect of making the big image, setting the actual image of the big image to the image of the small image we clicked on. We're just copying the source attribute across. So that's quite a nice feature. It enables us to do quite a good manipulation of the DOM, and importantly, it's doing it in such a way that we don't have to write out in the code which particular image we're talking about. We can just grab it from the context of what small image we just clicked on. So this is a very useful feature. jQuery is very useful. It allows us to write this code so that we don't have to repeat ourselves and write code for every single thumbnail image. I just want to say one last thing, which is to be a little bit careful with this, because it can mean different things in different contexts. So it means as long as you're in an event function like click or one of the other ones like hover or mouse over, it means the HTML element that the event happened to. But in different contexts, it means different things. It's quite a complex and difficult feature of JavaScript. So at this moment, I would stick to using it within this context of events. So we've got now a nice little function which does what we want. It happens when we click on one of the images, any of the images. From that image, it figures out the actual source attribute of that image, puts it into the source attribute of the big image, and we set the big image to be equal to the little image. Let's have a final look at that to remind ourselves what it does. We can click on any of these, and whichever one we click on, it loads up this big image. And the really nice thing about that is we've done it with only a fairly small number of lines of JavaScript, and it works with all of these. So there we have it. We've got our first sort of proper interactive website with JavaScript that's starting to look like the kind of website you're going to want to build, like a real website. So at this stage, you're now ready to go on and start building some own websites of your own that uses HTML, CSS and JavaScript, and start playing along with that. We've got a final MOOC in this course next week where we'll go a bit deeper into JavaScript and work with some new and slightly more complex features of it. But for this week, I will see you later. Congratulations, now you know about all three languages you're going to use for web development, HTML, CSS and JavaScript. In the final module of this MOOC, we're going to take that a little bit further and look at a more complex example that uses advanced JavaScript features. So looking forward to seeing you soon for that module. Welcome to the last module of this course. We're going to take the HTML, CSS and JavaScript skills you've been learning and apply them to a bigger example where we're going to create an image-based slideshow website. For that, we're going to need some more advanced JavaScript features like variables and if statements, and we're going to put all those things together to build a nice-looking professional website. Welcome back. In the last module we looked at creating interactive websites, building on the HTML and the CSS that we've done previously, to use JavaScript to manipulate in real time what's happening in the website based on user interaction. We ended that up with a nice image gallery example where users could click on images and sort of click on a small thumbnail and see the large image. Now I'm going to sort of play with that example a bit more and do something new with it. So this is pretty much the example we looked at last week, with one really important difference, that it's not simply clicking, the user isn't simply clicking on it. The web page itself is updating to create this slideshow effect, where we're going from one image to the next one. And that's quite a nice common effect in a lot of websites. We normally add some sort of nice things like smooth fades and all this, but I wanted to show a fairly simple example of this. So this kind of example is something we'd like to build for this week, but it requires a number of important features. And one which might not be obvious is that to do this, we need to keep track of which image we're currently displaying, because we need to know which one to do next. So we need to know where we are, which is our current image, and to switch to the next one, we need to know which the next one is based on the current one. So, and that actually brings us to some quite new functionality that we haven't seen before, because what we need to do actually to do this is to count. We know that we're at image 1, so we need to go to image 2. Once we're at image 2, we need to go to image 3. And once we're at image 3, we need to go to image 4. Seems a pretty basic thing to do for us. And, it's a pretty basic thing for a computer to do as well. They're very good at counting. But I'm going to show you how to do that. And in particular, how to keep track of the current value of the count. So counting and keeping track of a value is based on something called a variable. Now, you can think of a variable as a little box in the memory of the computer, and that box can hold a value. So, for example, this box holds a value 1. The value isn't necessarily a number. It can be many things, including sort of text and other things, but for now we're going to look at numbers. And it's important to be able to have that number somewhere so that we know and we can remember, or the computer remembers, that we're currently displaying image 1. So when it's time to transition to the next one, we display image 2. So we've got this little box, and it's keeping track of our count, but we need to be able to know how to get hold of it and know how to use it. And to do that, we need to give it a name. This is like we gave names to functions in the last module. We give names to a variable so we can then access the value of that variable later. And the really important thing about variables, if you take the name variables into account, is that they vary, they change their value, which is exactly what we need because we need to go to 1, 2, 3, 4. So we take a value 1 and we can change that value and set it to 2. Let's have a look at sort of how that actually works in practice. So this is some code to create a variable. Now, the first line is this thing var. That stands for variable. It tells us it's a variable. That's just like what we do when creating a function. We say function before we do anything else, so that JavaScript knows we're creating a function. And what saying var does is basically creates a little box, that little box we see on the right of the screen. The next we give it a name, so we call it counter because we're counting. So we've got a box with a name so that we can use it later. And then we say this equals. Now what this equals does is set the value of the variable. This is quite an important thing because actually you can equals can have two meanings. Sometimes equals means A and B are equal, means they are the same. But actually in this programming context, it doesn't mean counter is equals to 0. It means we're setting counter equals to 0. Counter becomes equal to 0. And we have to set it to a value, and this value is 0, or could be 1, or any value we like, really. So that last bit, equals 0, is putting a value into our little box. So we've got a box with a name and a value in it, and that defines our variable. And once we have our variable, we can use it in other contexts, just as we can see down here in just ordinary JavaScript code where we'd use everywhere else. We can use the name of that variable, in this case counter, put it in, and wherever we use the name of that variable, it gets replaced by the value in that variable. So we can use set the text of a particular HTML element, as we're doing here, to be equal to the value of that counter, and it will be 0. If we do it again and we change the value, it will be a different value. Whatever value we have will be put into the HTML, replacing where we've written out the name of the variable. So this is a really, really important feature of JavaScript and all programming. I'm sure if you're used to programming, this is not a very novel concept to you. Though the one thing I will say, if we go back to the beginning of this slide, is if you're used to a language like Java, you may be surprised that I'm not putting a type there. I'm saying var instead of a type. JavaScript is not a typed language. A variable can be anything. It can be a number, floating point, integers, text. The same type of variables can hold all those values. So just be aware of that. You don't need to worry about types in JavaScript. If you're completely new to programming or haven't programmed in a typed language, you probably don't know what I'm talking about. You don't have to worry about it. That's a feature that exists in other languages that has certain benefits, but it makes programming a little bit more complex. In JavaScript, it's quite simple. You don't have to. You can create a variable and put whatever you like into it, and you don't have to worry. So that's the basics of variables. In the next video, I'd like to show you how to use a variable in practice. Okay, in the last video I told you about variables. I want to take you through a first simple example of how to use a variable, and this is going to be a very simple web page. In the future videos we're going to use it to do something a bit more real. But this really simple web page is even simpler than the ones we ran last week. It's just a single number. And what that does though is this number is our count. We're gonna use this page for counting, and whenever I press on this number, it counts up. So that we can see is we're implementing the basic functionality we might want to use with a variable. We've got this value and we're changing its value. So I'm going to take you through the code now. So here is the code. As usual, we've got jQuery in there because we're manipulating HTML elements. And we've got an h1, which is our number. We've given it ID number so that we know what that is. And we've got an onClick, as we saw in last week's module. We're calling this function count, and I'll show you that in a minute. One thing to note is that this doesn't actually have any content. So that may seem a little bit strange at first. We've got an h1 with nothing in there. But the reason I'm putting nothing in there, and this is quite a common technique, is that I don't want to sort of hard code anything in there. I want to give it its content directly via JavaScript. And you'll see increasingly as we go into web programming, a lot of the content is going to be put in via JavaScript. It's not going to be put in, directly typed into the HTML. And here is that JavaScript. So I'm going to look at these first two lines first, because they're exactly what we did in the last session. We're setting the variable counter equal to 0, and we're using this variable, we're putting that into the HTML. As I said in the last video, using this variable as input to a function lets us just copy across the value that's in that variable. So when I write, as I do here, HTML brackets counter, the value that's inside counter is getting copied into the call to HTML. And that value has been set up here to be equal to 0. So that's pretty much what we saw in the last video, and the end result is that we've got this number that's showed on our web page. If we very quickly go back and reload the web page, we see that the result of that code is a web page that displays 0. Pretty simple. Before I move on to the next bit of the code, I'd like to sort of briefly recap what we talked about last week to really understand that, and then show how we can start changing that value. So here we are. If you remember, we create a variable by using the word var, give it a name, and this is the bit I'm interested in now. We're setting the value of this variable to be 0. So equals puts a value into the variable. Now, in this first example, we're doing this as we're creating a variable. And normally, as you create a variable, you're always going to put a value in it, so there's something there. It's possible to not do that, and we've got this weird thing called undefined, which is what the value of a variable that has no value. But most of the time you want a variable to have a value, so you're going to put a value in there. But there's no reason that you always have to put a value into the variable only at the beginning. You can then change that value. That's the point of a variable. So I'm going to take you through that. So before we get to changing the value, here's another example. Now, as I said, we can use the value of the variable wherever we could use any other kind of number. So a variable is just like a number, it's just like a value, and I can use it in the same way. And here I'm using it to set another variable. I'm taking a new variable called newCounter, and setting it equal to counter. There's nothing to stop me doing that. That's perfectly valid. Counter is a value. I'm just putting one value into another value. It's a very common programming technique. And I'm actually setting it to counter +1. So again, I can do maths on variables. I can add 1 to my variable. So the result is this isn't changing counter. It's just taking the value in counter, which is initially 0, adding 1 to it, and putting that value into my new variable, newCounter. So that is creating a new variable with a value that is based on counter. But I don't even have to stop there. I can actually use the value of my variable counter and use that to change the value of counter. So I'm taking my variable counter and setting that equal to the current value of counter +1. So I'm taking counter, adding 1 to it, and putting it back into counter so that I've got a new value for counter, which is 1 more than it was before. And that has exactly the effect I showed here. We're taking the value is 1, we add 1 to it and put it back, and it's 2. So we have our variable now has updated, it's got a new value, it's changed, and we can go ahead and do something new with it. So that sort of simple operation, +1, put it back, gives us the ability to count and move on, which is a very common programming practice. Count and do something with the next value. And I'll show you now in more fuller code how we actually use that to display a different number each time we click. So this is our function count, which is actually doing this counting and updating. As we saw up here, it's our onClick function of our element. And we're doing exactly what I said. We're taking counter, we're adding 1 to it and putting it back into counter. So we've now got this new updated value of counter. The only thing we need to do now is actually put that back into the HTML page. So just because the variable has changed, it doesn't mean the HTML will have updated. We need to do that manually. And this is just what we do with this line of code, which is exactly identical to this previous line of code here. So we're just repeating this operation where we're setting the HTML value of the number element to the value of counter. And what that does is when we click, we update the value and it writes it back and we can see that value. And so as I click, the numbers are going to go up. Make that bigger just to make sure you can see it because it's quite small on the screen. And I can carry on counting pretty much forever. Okay, so we've now managed to use variables to remember something, remember where we are in our count, and then reflect that back into the HTML. So we can show this sort of counter going on in our page. Every time we click, it goes up 1. But that isn't really sort of a particularly exciting web page. So over the next few videos, I'll show you a more complex example where we're using the same basic principle of counting to create a slideshow based on the image gallery we looked at last time. Great, so now you know about variables, and I've told you they're an incredibly useful part of the JavaScript language, but so far, we haven't done anything that amazing with them. You can show a number on your web page, and that's occasionally useful, but it's not going to blow the world away. So let's look at a little bit more depth about how we can use a variable in an extended example, and we're going to use it a bit more behind the scenes. So you're never actually going to see the variable on screen. It's just going to affect the behavior. So this is the example I want to look at. It's an image gallery. Now we've got a bunch of thumbnails up the top here, and we've got a big image here, and we can click on the thumbnails to show the big image. So that's kind of similar to some of the stuff we did last week. But the thing I really want you to look at are these backwards and forwards buttons. So this forward button, what it does is it steps through the images one by one. So you're going from the first image to the second image to the third image. So that's a nice little app, and I'll take you through how to build that. But what has that got to do with variables? What's the relationship between a bunch of images and the number we were looking at in the last video? Well, there's a really important relationship, and this is typical of so much programming in JavaScript and programming in general, that behind the scenes, lots of the stuff that you see on a web page can be represented as numbers, and that allows us to do some quite powerful effects by simply calculating on those numbers. So what are those numbers? Well, the most important thing we can look at in terms of these numbers is that we've got 4 images, and that we can count these images. So this graffiti image is image 1, the cheese is image 2, the synthesizer is image 3, and the city night is image 4. So behind the scenes, each of these images has a number, and as long as we can do calculations on that number, then we can act on these images. And really, though it seems very, very different, it's exactly what we were doing last time. So we started off at 1 with a number 1, and we showed 1, then we clicked on it, it showed number 2. We clicked on it, it showed number 3. We clicked on it, it showed number 4. That's what we did last time. And really what we want to do here is no different. We start at image 1. We click. We show image 2. We click. We show image 3. We click. We show image 4. It's the same thing, only instead of directly showing the number, we're grabbing hold of that numbered image and showing it on screen. So let me take you through some of the code that does that. So this is the code of the page. It's based on Matthew's example from Module 2. So I've got his style sheets, and you'll be able to download a zip file which contains all of these files. You'll need them in the right directory. A little bit of header stuff, that's not so important. And then we've got a Bootstrap layout, a basic grid with some images in. All of these images. I'll come back to exactly what I'm talking about today, but we've got these images. Each of these images has a class crop image. That's used in the CSS. So just as we saw in Matthew's CSS lecture, we can use the class to apply CSS. But in my last module, we showed how we could use JavaScript to use the same CSS selectors to add functionality. And I'll quickly show you down the bottom how I've done that to allow clicking on an image to select it. So this is the bit where I'm clicking an image. I'm grabbing all of the HTML elements with the class crop image. Those are all the little thumbnail images. I'm calling the click function, which we saw last week, and we're doing this. So we're grabbing an element within ID big image. That's up here. It's a very simple ID. It's just an image, and with an image source as usual. And this time I'm setting the image source to be equal to the image source of this. This is the stands in for the image that we've clicked on. So when we click on the little thumbnail, that thumbnail image appears inside this variable called this. This behind the scenes is a variable. We didn't know about that last week, but it is a variable, and what's in it is the HTML element that you've just clicked on. So doing this dot attribute source will get the source of that attribute and put it into the big image. Okay, that's fine. That's what we've done before. So let's look at how we can go back and swap between images based on their number. How am I actually representing images as numbers? So this is how I'm doing it. I've got an ID for each image, and the last character of that ID is a number. Sorry, that one. So I've got image 1, image 2, image 3, image 4. It's as simple as that. You know, it's behind the scenes. There's an ID, and that ID contains a number. In future courses in this specialization, we'll look at much more sophisticated ways of doing this. But for now, this works well enough. So now if we go down to the code, we can see here we've also got a variable. Just like last week, we've got this counter variable, and just like in the last video, this counter will go from 1, 2, 3, 4. And this is the basic thing that we're going to be doing. We're going to be using jQuery to click an image, calling click on its own without a function, passing in a function. What that does is it calls the click function. So it's like doing a virtual click. We click on it, and instead of actually clicking on it, we can write some code that does the same thing as clicking on it. But the interesting thing is in here. So we're grabbing an image by its ID, but we're actually, instead of just typing in the ID, we're creating the ID in code. All of the images we saw earlier started off with their ID with image. So we've just got this text hash image is the start of the ID, and we're adding counter onto it. So we're putting a number at the end. So this expression, this code will change, the ID we're using will change every time counter changes. So when it's, if counter's 1, we'll get image 1. If counter's 2, we'll get image 2. If counter's 3, we'll get image 3. So this is what allows us to get different images based on the state of our variable. And this here in the middle is the code that actually does that. I'll come back to the rest of the code around it later. There are a few other complicated things. So we're grabbing an element here with ID forward. That's just the forward button I showed you when I showed you the example. And we're giving it a click function. This function does two things. First, it adds 1 to the counter. Exactly as we saw in the last video, we're adding 1 to the counter. In the last video, we then showed that counter by putting it onto a bit of HTML. We're not going to do that. Instead, what we're going to do is use it to grab hold of an HTML element with that number and use jQuery to change that element. And that's what we do here. It's exactly the same code we saw above. We've got, we're taking image, putting the number onto it, so we're going to get image 1, image 2, image 3, depending on the value of the counter, and then we're going to call click on it. And as we saw, calling click on it is like a virtual click. It will have exactly the same effect as if we actually clicked on that image. So we're basically just selecting that image. So let's look at all that again. Clicking on an image will select it. If we then press the forward button, it goes to the next image and selects that one. Okay, so let's have a quick recap of that code, and I want to point out an important feature of it. So this is the code we were looking at. We started a variable. We create this variable starts at 1, very much like we did last video, I mean. Then we add 1 to it, again, exactly like last lesson. And this is the bit that's different. Instead of just displaying the image, the variable value, we're using it to get hold of an image. And again, that's just like any other bit of jQuery where we're getting hold of something by its ID, but now we're using this variable to create that ID from our program. And then we're just using click to virtually click, selecting this image. If you have a background in Java or sort of any other, most other languages other than JavaScript, then you might have spotted something that seems a bit odd. And this is one of these things I was talking about last module where, you know, JavaScript is really quite a different language from a lot of other languages. And so some things might not work in quite the same way. And this is a very different but very powerful feature of JavaScript. If you're not used to JavaScript, you'll see that this variable counter is created outside of the function click, but that we're using it inside the function click. In a lot of other languages, this would not be allowed because they're in different scope. But in JavaScript, this is doing something different. Because click is defined just after counter, and to say this formally, click is defined in the scope of the variable counter, then the variable click sort of captures that scope and is able to use the variable counter, and it becomes part of the scope of the variable click. And what that is, that's called something called a closure. So the scope of the variable counter is put into the scope of the variable click. This is a very, very powerful feature of JavaScript. It makes it easy to create a variable and update it in a number of functions. It's very different from, you know, what you might be used to in other languages, but don't worry. If you haven't programmed in other languages and you don't know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about scope, don't worry, it just works as I've explained. Okay, so we've now gone on from, you know, basic uses of a variable to actually using it in practice in a web page. You can now use a variable behind the scenes to really make changes in the web page. It's a very powerful feature. And I just want to make a point of what we've really done. What we've used the variable for is used it to remember what's happening in the web page. We've remembered which image we're showing, whether we're showing image 1, 2, 3, 4. And then based on the current image, which image we're showing, what we've remembered, we can move on to the next one. So if we've remembered image 2, we move on to image 3. And that is a very, very powerful feature that we're going to use all across JavaScript programming in many different ways. And I'm going to show you one of those in one of the later videos of this module. So please come back to the next lesson and we'll find out more. Okay, in the last video you found out how to use variables to sort of control what was going on inside a slideshow app. But there's one thing about the slideshow app that that I want to show you that sort of wasn't really covered by what was going on last week, and you might have spotted that. So here we are, the slideshow. We can select the first one. Actually, let me restart it just to be clear what's going on. So when it appears, first we've got the first elements, and then we go on to the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And at this point we've reached the last element. So what happens then? Well, when we click on the last element, we go back to the beginning. And that's fine, that's a reasonable thing to do, that's a good thing to do. But the code we looked at last week doesn't do that. Because the code we looked at in the last video, all it does is count. So we start at 1, then we go on up to 2, then we go on to 3, then we go on to 4. And when we hit 4, we have the same code. All it does is exactly the same thing. It takes counter, adds 1 to it, and we get 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. But that won't work because we don't have an image 5, we don't have an image 6, we don't have an image 7. We've run out of images. So we need to do something different. We need to, in this case, go back to the beginning. But in any case, once we reach the end, there's always something different we have to do. And I'm going to show you how to do that, because really what this is about is making a decision. At certain points in your program, you can't carry on just doing the same thing. You need to decide to do something different. And we're deciding to do something different depending at what value of the counter we are. So what number we've reached. And I'm going to show you how to do that. Okay, so let's look at that in a bit more detail. We need to know if the counter's more than 4. If it's less than 4, it's fine, because we've got 4 images. So if it's image 1, 2, 3, 4, we can just show it. But if it's more than 4, then we've got a problem because we haven't got that image. So we need to do something different. So we need to make a decision based on if the count is more than 4. If it's not more than 4, no, it's less than 4, we can display the image and carry on counting. But if it is more than 4, then we need to do something different. In that case, what we need to do is loop back to the beginning. So we're making a decision based on this variable. Less than or equal to 4, fine. You know, just display the image. We've got an image there, we can show it, and we can carry on as before. More than 4, we've run out of images. Let's go back to the beginning. And what that actually means in practice is the counter needs to go back and be set to 1, to the first image. So we're making a decision, we're branching our program. Based on it, we're doing one of two things. Carrying on as usual, which actually basically means doing nothing, or doing something special for when we've got more than 4, in which case we have to loop back to 0. And I'll show you how to do that. So here's the actual code, and the important bit is in the middle. We've got this if. This is called an if statement. As I said in my last slide, I started with if we are more than 4, and this is exactly what I'm going to translate into code. If is a built-in word in the language that allows you to make these decisions. If the counter is more than 4, this bit says the counter is more than 4, the counter is greater than 4. is what we call a Boolean expression. I'll come back a little bit to what Boolean means in the next lesson, but for now we just think about it, yes or no, true or false, is it more than 4 or not? And the important thing is that it's the condition, it's what we're using to make the decision. And then we're doing something if it is more than 4. So this is the code that we want to run, it's the body of the code. Now, this all looks quite a lot like a function actually, because we've got if, we've got some standard brackets with something in, and we've got some curly brackets. It's not a function. The syntax is similar, but it's actually something quite different. The counter more than 4 is not an argument, it's what we call a condition, and the body of the code is still code that's run, but it's run based on that decision, not based on when the function is called. But the syntax looks quite similar, and as we'll see, the body of the code is inside these curly brackets, and we've used standard curved brackets, parentheses, for the condition. So let's look at that in context. This is the code I showed you in the last lesson, but with this extra thing in the middle. So here we're saying exactly that. If the counter is more than 4, counter is equal to 1. But how does that work in the context of the whole program? So you click on the forward button. You add 1 to the counter. You always add 1, but in this case now 2 things can happen. Either the counter is less than or equal to 4, in which case nothing happens, or the counter is now more than 4, in which case we need to do something. If it's more than 4, it triggers this if statement and it runs this code. All this code does is set counter to 1, which goes back to the beginning. And either way, at the end, we're just displaying the image again. So this could be the next one in the sequence, or we could have gone back to 1, in which case we're showing image 1. And here's just a reminder of what it does. Starts off with the first image, fine. 1, 2, 3, 4. We hit 4, it loops back to the beginning. So we've learnt another really important feature of JavaScript. If you've done a lot of programming before, it'll be a very familiar one, if statements. But if you're new to it, it's very, very powerful. And just like variables, we're going to be using it throughout this specialization. And all the time you're web programming, you're going to be using if statements. As I said, if you've programmed before, for once, it's not too different from other languages. There are some sort of very minor differences, but you don't have to worry too much. It's not one of these strange JavaScript features. If you haven't programmed before, well, I'm going to take you through another example in the next video, and hopefully help you understand a little bit better what you can use if statements for. So I will see you at the next lesson. Okay, fantastic, well done. You've learned 2 really important features of JavaScript, variables and if statements. Let's learn a little bit more about them as we delve into another bit of this example. So in the last 2 videos we've been going through this slideshow example, but it's not really a slideshow yet. The point of a slideshow is not that you click every time to move it forwards, but that you're able to advance it yourself. It starts going itself, and here I am, I'm not touching the keyboard anymore, and it's moving forward on its own. So this is what I want to show you how to do in this lesson. So to do that, it's almost as if I'm asking the computer, the browser, to do my work for me. Up to now I've been manually clicking on the forward button, and all I want to say now is actually you do the clicking, just every second or so, click on the forward button. And JavaScript has a great feature that allows you to do that, so I'm going to show that to you. So this is actually the code that does that. And there's a special function called setInterval. What setInterval does is that it calls a function that you give it every sort of however much time you want. So you just tell it a function and say call this every, could be 1 second, could be half a second, could be 10 seconds. You make a decision about how often you want to call it. So it's calling this function I'm passing in. The function is just calling forward.click. so it's virtually clicking on the forward button. And then it's got another argument, which is this number 1000. And what that is I want it to click every 1000 milliseconds, which is actually a second. So computers are really, really fast. So a lot of the time in computer programming, doing stuff in seconds is far too slow. So we say stuff in milliseconds, so that we can have quite a fine-grained control of how often something happens. So it's very easy to say, sort of half a second, even tenth of a second, hundredth, thousandth of a second. In this context, we want a second, so we're just saying 1000 milliseconds equals 1 second. And that will give us exactly what we want, and it will advance every second. It will move on to the next image by simply doing a virtual click on the forward button. So here it is again. The gallery is just moving from one image to the next to the next. And that's fine, but it can actually get a little bit annoying after a while. I like to see it, but, I'd also like to be able to stop and say, sort of pause, I just want to look at this image for a bit in it. So we also need that feature. So what I've implemented is that I can pause it, and then just by clicking on the main image, and it'll just not do anything, it'll stay there, and I can look at that image properly. But we need to have some way of doing that, and it actually comes back to what we were talking about in the last lesson. So last lesson we talked about making decisions. If the count is more than 4, we need to do something special. And actually it's the same thing again. We need to know, are we paused or are you not paused? If we're not paused, we can go ahead and start moving forward. But if we are paused, we don't want to do that. So this is the decision we're looking at. If we're paused, yes, well, we'll do nothing. But if we aren't paused, no, we can go to the next image. So it looks very similar to what we're doing last week, last lesson, I mean. But there's a couple of differences which I'll come to. And one of the differences is that we've no longer got, how do we represent the fact that we're paused? And I'll come to that in a minute. But before we do that, I want to sort of look at a little bit more detail about this yes and no. Because we need to be able to say sort of what is yes, what is no. And we've got a way of representing that inside a computer. Yes is true, so if paused is true, if the fact that we're paused is true, we do one thing, we do nothing. If it's false, we have to do something and go into the next image. Now, one simple thing to note about this, which we'll come back to in a minute, is that in this case, we're doing something special when we're not paused. We have to do something when we're not paused. On false, no. And that's a little bit different. I'll come back to how we do that. But the important thing actually is that we need a way of saying we're paused. And we can actually do that with another variable. So we can actually create a variable like this for paused, and we can give it a value true. So we can directly use a value that we can use inside an if statement. And this is called a Boolean variable. Comes from famous mathematician George Boole, who invented a branch of mathematics based on true and false rather than on numbers. So we've got this value, paused is true. Actually, we probably want to start at paused is false. Well, we're not sure actually. We could start paused is false, so it automatically starts. But either way, we start in one way. And we can use that directly as a condition, because what a condition needs something that's true or false. If a condition is true, you do the body of the if statement. If it's false, you don't do it. So a Boolean variable like this is something we can directly use inside that condition. It's all fine. And you can, inside the body, you call forward only when you aren't paused. So when you're not paused, you call click. But hang on a sec, I've missed something there. I missed that important thing that I told you, that we're not doing something special when we are paused. When we are paused, we're just doing nothing. We need to do the stuff when we're not paused. So we actually need to do something on the false version of it. And that's what this funny exclamation mark is doing. This is actually pronounced not. It's like saying If something is true, not something, if paused is true, not paused is false. If paused is false, not paused is true. So we're basically giving it the opposite of what paused is doing. So when not paused means that, if not paused means that we're going to do stuff at the time when paused is false. When we're not paused, do something special. When we are paused, paused is true. We're just going to do nothing because we're paused. We shouldn't be doing anything at all. So let's look at that in practice. Inside our set interval, we've got now, if not paused, do it, do the click. Fairly straightforward what I've shown you. Let's look at that in practice. At the start of my script, I've got this variable pause. I've set it to false. So we're not paused. We're starting doing the slideshow. And down here in set interval, I've actually got the pause variable and that if statement I've just shown you. So that when we hit pause, it's going to stop. But there's something missing. We need to be able to change the value of paused. And that's something we need to know how to do, right? We can just create a click function and set its value to true. If we look at the slide here, this is exactly what we're doing. We've got big image is the big image we're displaying. When we click on that, we set pause equals true. And let's have a quick look at that. So I'll just restart it. Here it is in the web page. It's going through, and if I click it, it will stop. It stayed there. Okay, that's good, but there's still a problem. You know, now I've paused my slideshow. What do I do now? I want it to start again, but I click and click and click, it never starts again. Why is that? Because we've set paused to true, but we've never set it back to false again. So actually, what we want is we don't want to always set pause to be equal to true when we click on the image. Sometimes we want to set it to true. If it's false, so we're not paused, we want it to pause. But if we are paused, we want it to unpause, to start again. So what we do, what the click does, depends on what pause is. So we want to, instead of just setting it to true, we actually want to set it to its opposite. If pause is true, we set it to false. If pause is false, we set it to true. So we don't actually want this code, this just turns pause on. We actually want something different, and this code on the right is what we want. We've seen this exclamation mark before. It says not. And so what we're doing is we're taking pause and setting it to be equal to not paused. So if paused is true, it becomes false. If pause is false, it becomes true. That's exactly what we want. Here it is in practice. Paused equals not paused. And when I save that, I can open it up. I can click, it will move on. I can click again, it will pause. And I can click again and it should start. There we go. So great. You now know a lot more about if statements and variables, and a really great way that if statements and variables can interact. In the last lesson, we looked at how we can take a numerical variable and sort of, based on a calculation of it, make a decision. This time we looked at something much more direct. We looked at a variable that can directly represent a condition, true or false, and we can use that to turn things on and off. And it's a great way of turning on and off important functionality in a program. And it's something that, again, we'll use loads and loads throughout web programming. So now we have quite a nice little slideshow example that has lots of features. You'll be able to download the full source code for that. And we're almost done. What I want to do in the next lesson is show you that, you know, this isn't just about slideshows, and that we can create actually quite a nice different example, but using very, very similar code. So I'm looking forward to seeing you at the next lesson. Well, well done. You're really getting into depth in JavaScript, and over the last few weeks of this course, you've learned HTML, CSS, JavaScript. You're really getting to grips with web programming. You'll soon be ready to really go on and make your first full interactive website. And over the last, one of the things we did was look at this really nice slideshow image gallery example and how that uses a lot of all those languages, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, used variables, used if statements. And I'd really encourage you to download the source code and look through it, read through it. There are a couple of things in there that I didn't have time to mention in the videos. But I don't want you going away and thinking the things we've given you are just for making image galleries. So in this last lesson, I want to go through another example, which on the surface looks pretty different, but actually behind the scenes, the design, the functionality, and more importantly, the code are really similar to what we've seen before. So here it is. It's an e-reader. It's designed to read a book. Well, in this case, a play, Hamlet by William Shakespeare. On the left-hand side here, we've got thumbnails of all the chapters, and we were able to click on one of those and read it. And we can scroll down and do the reading. And when we've reached the end of this scene, we can click on it to move forward. And if I actually want to move back and read the previous scene, I can click on the left-hand side of the window, and clicking on the right-hand side moves me forward. So it's just like a lot of e-readers work. You've got a table of contents. You're able to see the overall structure of the book, or in this case the play, and you've got a main reader panel, and clicking moves you forwards and backwards. But you should hopefully already see that structurally this is very similar to what we're looking for. It's a very different application area, but the structure is the same. You've got a bunch of chapters in this case, not images, and you're able to navigate them either by clicking on them or moving backwards and forwards. So I'm going to quickly give you an overview of the code. Again, I'm not going to go into full detail on this code because you're going to be able to download it yourself from the zip, and I really encourage you to read it through. It's fully commented. I mean, all the code that you'll be able to download is fully commented, but some of the examples I showed you in the videos didn't have comments just for space reasons. So here's the code. It's got the usual libraries included. It's got a Bootstrap layout. In this case, I've got one big row with two columns. One column is for the thumbnails, the chapter outline. The other column is for the main view. And here are our chapter outlines. I've actually got an unordered list. It's actually got two classes. Both of these are for Bootstrap. It says it's a list group. That is how, just controls how Bootstrap renders it. That gives it that nice appearance. And it's scrollable, and I've given it an ID chapter list. And these are the actual elements in it. We've got each of the chapter items this time is a list item. Kind of makes sense. It is a list. I've got an ID, chapter 0. As you note, just as in the previous example, the ID contains a number. And it's got two classes. List group item, that's for Bootstrap. That tells it how to lay it out. And chapter thumbnail, that's our one. We're going to use that later in our own code to control how the functionality of this page. And the contents is just the contents of that scene. This is just the title page, but a little bit smaller so it's a bit clearer. But as we'll see as we go down here, we've got the incomplete act. And this is a pretty big HTML file because I've got the first five scenes, the first act of Hamlet, copied into this HTML file. Occasionally we stop to open a new chapter. In some ways this isn't really the greatest way of doing it, copying all the text into an HTML file. And in fact, if you go on to the next course in this specialization, responsive web design, we'll actually look carefully about how to get around this and separate out the content, the text of the website from the structure of the HTML. But for now, we'll do it this way. So I can scroll down all the way through, and the real business happens near the bottom. We've got, I'll show you just before we hit the JavaScript, we've got this, this is the div where the main text is going to go. It starts off empty because we're going to fill it up with using JavaScript, not directly in HTML. And also it's got this class well. Well is just this nice view that you have. If we look at the actual page, it's this nice sort of grey indented view. It's a Bootstrap feature. And then the important stuff is the script. This is exactly the same. We've got a counter variable. Very similar here. We take one of the thumbnails. We've got a click function which selects it. The code is almost the same, except we're not setting the source attribute. We're just directly setting the HTML. So far, very, very similar to our previous example and this current example. I've done a couple of special things. One thing that was missing in the last example is actually by selecting on it, when you clicked on an element, it wasn't actually updating the value of the counter. So you could actually get lost. So you'd click on an element, but it wouldn't restart counting from that one. Actually, to make it work properly, you need to, if you click on element 3, you need to set the counter to element 3. How do we do that? Well, this line of code gets the ID attribute of this, which is the element we've clicked on. So that's the actual thumbnail we've clicked on. So we're getting its ID. And we know its ID ends in a number. And this is a little complicated little bit of code that does two important things. First, it gets the last character in that ID, which we know is going to be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And we turn that, it's currently a character, it's a bit of text, we turn it into a number. ID slice, so slice is if you've got a string, a bit of text, it gets a sub-string of that, so only part of that text. Passing in -1 just gets you the last character in it. So you've got a character, parseInt just turns that into a number. You can look up both of these functions in the JavaScript documentation, and I really encourage you to use the JavaScript documentation in future. I can only tell you so much about what you can do in JavaScript. There's so much more. Go ahead and look up and find out, you know, if you want to do, how do I join two strings together? Look up, Google or you know, Yahoo or whatever, how do I join two strings, and you'll get an answer. It's actually the join function, but you don't need me to tell you that. You can look it up. There's lots and lots of documentation out there. So that's one nice new feature that I've added, the ability to properly update the counter. This is pretty much the same as a previous example. And we've also got this click function on the main viewer. And as we looked, when we click the main viewer, what it does is it moves forward or backwards. We don't have separate forward or backwards buttons. But we do need to know whether to move forward or backwards, and that depends on where we've clicked inside this viewer. So I need to do something a little bit special. And I've got this event.offsetX. Event is an object. It represents the event that happened when I click. So it's got some data that relate to the click. The important thing I want to know is where was the click inside the element I've clicked on. And that's given by this sub-variable, what we call a member variable called offsetX. There are various different variants. So, for example, if I want, where did I do it on the entire page, it's something different. Look that up. But in this case, it's offsetX. And what I want to do is figure out where offsetX is on the element. Is it on the left-hand side and the right-hand side? So I take the width of it, of this, which is the entire sort of big main viewer, and multiply it by 3. So that gives us a position that's 30% of the way across the viewer. So if I'm 30% across the viewer, it means I've clicked on the left. If I'm in the other 70%, it means I've clicked on the right. That's a nice way of doing it. So most of the time you're going to be going forward, so you want a bit more space for going forward, and you only want to click right on the left-hand side if you're going backwards. So if I've clicked less than 30%, it means I'm going left, so I do counter equals counter -1, reducing the count, otherwise counting forwards. And then I'm doing the same things. I'm using my if statement, and I'm doing what I did last time, which is if I've reached the end, or in this case the beginning, I need to do something special. But actually, instead of looping round, in this case I just want to stop. So if my counter is less than 0, it means I've gone beyond the beginning of it. I just want to stay at 0. I wanted to show you one last clever bit, which is this bit here, which is how I know I've reached the end. In the last example, I just wrote that number 4. I knew how many one it was. But it's better not to do that. It's better to just actually figure out, because I might change the number and I might forget to update, the bit of code that says there's 4. So I'm going to actually get it directly from the thumbnails. And what I'm doing here is this bit of jQuery, that's getting all of the chapter thumbnails. So all the elements that have class chapter thumbnail. And I'm doing .length. And what that does is just tell me how many there are. So jQuery chapter thumbnails.length is the number of chapter thumbnails I've got. And that's great because I can use it directly. Here I'm saying if we're more than the number of chapter thumbnails, so we're more than the number of chapters, set the counter equal to, make that a little bit clearer, chapter thumbnails.length -1. Because the chapter thumbnails, we actually always count from 0, the last one is chapter thumbnails -1. That's just a sort of little odd feature. I'll come back to that in the next course of this specialization to explain it. And then, the last thing we do is exactly the same as we did last time. We just call click. So there's another complete example. And what I really want to show you is that, you've learned a lot of skills. You know a lot of stuff now. And you've seen how to create a great gallery app. But it's not just about creating gallery apps. All of those bits of functionality that you've learned, all the things you know how to do, can be used in lots and lots of ways. And so it's time now not to just go and rebuild something I've built, but be creative and think hard about how you can do something new. And as I said just earlier on in this video, you don't just have to follow what I've done in these videos or what Matthew's done. There's masses of documentation out there on HTML, CSS, JavaScript and jQuery. Everything's out there. If you want to know how to do something, just use a search engine. And there's loads of explanations everywhere. There's loads of support. That's how I learn. This is how I do it. There's loads of cases in preparing this course where, I didn't actually know how to do something, or I couldn't remember how to do something. It's like, how do you do that again? Sort of what's the jQuery function to do this? Or what's the right selector for that? I just looked it up. Information's all there. So don't feel yourself limited by what you've seen. Be creative. Think what you want to do. Go and look up in all this fantastic documentation and produce a website that you really can feel is your own. So really looking forward to seeing those websites and really enjoyed teaching you. Great work. After everything you've done in this course, you've got a really powerful suite of web development skills, from HTML right through to the JavaScript variables we looked at this time around, that are a really important tool in developing interactive websites, but also lay the foundations for data-driven web development, which is we're going to look at later in this specialization. But now it's the time to put your skills into practice to develop your own websites in the peer assessment that is going to round off this course.